I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I had planned this trip alone, as I usually do. The woods had always been my place to disconnect, to clear my head and find some peace away from the noise of everyday life. I'm not a seasoned survivalist or a hardened adventurer, but I have plenty of experience camping by myself. This trip was supposed to be routine. A weekend in the woods near a state park I had visited before, a place with plenty of trails and some decent campsites but far enough from heavy traffic or large groups of people. I packed my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, food, water filter, map, and compass. I also brought a small first aid kit and my phone, though I knew the reception would be spotty at best. I always make sure I have enough batteries for my headlamp and an extra flashlight. The weather forecast showed clear skies, and the temperature was supposed to drop at night, but nothing too harsh. I left Friday afternoon and arrived just before sunset. The trailhead was quiet. A few cars were parked, but most people had left by then. The smell of pine and damp earth greeted me as I started the hike to my chosen campsite, which was about 2 miles from the parking lot, tucked in a clearing beside a small creek. The trail was narrow but well-marked, and the crunch of my boots on the leaf litter was the only sound besides occasional bird calls and the wind rustling through the trees. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground a little away from the creek to avoid dampness, but close enough to hear the water's gentle flow. I stacked some firewood I gathered nearby, making sure it was dry enough to burn. My campsite felt good, peaceful, familiar. The sun was dipping below the trees when I started my fire, and soon I had a small blaze warming the air, the orange flames flickering against the darkening sky. I cooked some simple dinner, instant noodles with a bit of dried vegetables and some jerky, and ate slowly while watching the fire. The woods were already dark around me, and the sky above was clearing to reveal stars, scattered and cold. I packed away my food carefully, knowing the importance of keeping animals away, and crawled into my tent. The cool night air seeped in through the mesh, and I zipped myself in, ready to get some sleep. But the woods have their own way of reminding you they're not tame. I was just drifting off when I heard it. A soft noise, almost like a shuffle, coming from the trees a short distance away. My heart rate picked up. It wasn't an immediate alarm. No heavy footsteps or crashing branches. Just something light and deliberate, moving slowly. I stayed still, listening. The wind was low, so I could make out the faint sound of leaves being moved. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other small animal. I had heard similar noises countless times before. Still, something felt off. The noises didn't stop. They circled around the edge of my camp, keeping just out of sight. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam caught a few glowing eyes that disappeared quickly. Probably deer or raccoons, I thought. But then the noises grew louder and slower, more deliberate. Something bigger, something heavier than a raccoon. The soft crunching of leaves and twigs underfoot, but no animal sounds. No calls or growls, just movement. I grabbed my small pocket knife and held it close. The fire was dying down, sending flickering shadows across the forest floor. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was alone, safe, and that any animal would be scared of me. I didn't want to think about any other possibility, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Eventually, the noises stopped, but the silence that followed was heavy. I lay there, eyes wide open, ears straining to catch anything. I heard my own breath, my heartbeat, and then, faintly, a low snapping sound, like a broken branch off the trail, a few 100 feet away. I waited until dawn. The sky lightened gradually, casting gray hues across the tent. The fire was cold and the ground stiff with dew. I zipped up and stepped outside, the morning chill biting my face. I scanned the area carefully, but saw nothing unusual except a few prints in the mud near the creek. They were too large and uneven to be deer or bear. They looked human, maybe a man wearing heavy boots. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and there was no car near the parking lot anymore. No other campers either. I quickly packed my gear, deciding not to stay another night. The feeling of unease clung to me as I took down the tent, stacked the firewood, and prepared to hike out. The walk back felt different. Every crack and rustle in the bushes made me tense up. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail, avoiding glancing into the dense forest on either side. Halfway through, I spotted a figure up ahead, standing still between two trees, partially hidden in shadow. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move or make a sound. I couldn't see a face clearly, just the outline of a person in a dark jacket and pants. I stopped, froze, unsure what to do. The figure remained motionless. I wondered if it was a hunter or a lost camper, but why had I not heard them before? After a long moment, the figure turned slowly and disappeared between the trees without a sound. I kept walking, faster now, adrenaline pumping. The forest felt alive with eyes watching me from every shadow. When I reached the parking lot, my car was still there, but the area was empty. No other cars or people. My phone had no signal. I locked the doors and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me, but the road behind was empty. I didn't stop for hours, driving straight home. Once inside, I checked my phone. No missed calls or messages. The news showed no reports of anything unusual near the park. I thought maybe I had just imagined things, or that stress and the darkness had played tricks on me. But the prints near the creek stayed in my mind. Big, heavy boots, not animal tracks, and the feeling that something or someone had been watching me the entire time. I've never gone back to that spot. I still go camping, but I avoid places where I can't be sure I'm alone or safe. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I catch myself listening for that slow, crunching step in the shadows, wondering if whoever or whatever it was might still be out there. I packed my backpack carefully in the early morning light, the chill of the early fall air brushing against my skin. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air as I zipped up the last compartment, making sure everything was secure. I'd planned this trip for months. A solo weekend camping trip deep into the wilderness, far from any roads or towns. I wanted to be alone with nothing but the sounds of nature and my own thoughts. The kind of solitude you can't find anywhere else. The drive out to the trailhead was long but peaceful. I left before dawn, the road still dark and empty, only the soft hum of tires on asphalt to keep me company. When I finally arrived, the sun was just rising behind the ridges, lighting the sky in pink and orange streaks. The trailhead was quiet, the gravel parking lot empty except for one old truck rusting near the edge. I grabbed my pack and headed off. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with thick forest on both sides. Tall pines, birches, and maples stretched high overhead, their leaves a mix of gold, red, and fading green. The ground beneath my boots was soft with fallen leaves, slightly damp from last night's rain. The air was crisp and smelled like moss and wood smoke. Every step was quiet, except for the soft crunch of twigs and leaves underfoot. I'd planned to hike about 6 miles before setting up camp, somewhere near a small creek I'd found marked on my map. The trail climbed steadily, the forest growing denser, darker as the sun moved higher, but the tall trees kept the light patchy. Around midday, I stopped briefly to eat a granola bar and drink from my water bottle. My muscles felt good, not too tired, the steady rhythm of walking settling into something calm and meditative. As I approached the creek, the sound of running water grew louder, breaking the quiet forest sounds. The creek was small but fast, clear water rushing over smooth rocks and fallen branches. The bank was soft and muddy in places, with bright green ferns growing thick along the edges. I followed the creek upstream a bit until I found a flat clearing just big enough for my tent. The ground was firm and dry here, with a carpet of pine needles and leaves. Setting up camp was easy, practiced. I laid out my tent, pegged it tight, and set up my sleeping bag inside. The sun was beginning to lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I collected some dry wood and kindling nearby for a fire, careful to stay away from living branches or anything damp. It wasn't much, but it was enough to warm me and keep the bugs away. As I sat beside the small fire, eating some canned beans I'd heated on my portable stove, the forest around me seemed to grow quieter. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded away slowly as dusk deepened. The temperature dropped sharply. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stared into the fire's orange glow, feeling a calm but alert stillness. Then, just as the last light disappeared and the forest went dark, I heard it. A low crunching sound coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the leaves. I held still, listening. The sound stopped. Then, after a long pause, it started again. Slower, heavier steps, deliberate, coming closer. I didn't panic. I didn't run. I stayed quiet, breathing slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the dark tree line with my flashlight but saw nothing. The beam caught branches and leaves but no movement. The steps stopped right at the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from where I sat. The night was thick and cold, and I could almost hear my own pulse in my ears. For what felt like minutes, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the crackle of my fire and distant sounds of the creek. Then the steps started again, this time moving parallel to the clearing, circling around. I didn't move, not even to shift my weight. Something was out there, something big. The next few hours passed in a blur of tense silence. Every little noise made me freeze. A twig snapping, a rustle in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote. I stayed inside my tent eventually, zipping the door closed but leaving a small gap for my flashlight. The night was long, cold, and full of strange sounds, but nothing came closer. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind. The sun was weak through the fog, the forest still damp and chilly. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept my eyes open for any signs of what had been near my camp. That's when I saw it. Large footprints in the soft mud near the creek, way bigger than any bear tracks I'd seen before. The prints were deep and wide, with long claw marks pressing into the earth. My skin prickled. This wasn't any ordinary animal. The prints didn't match anything I'd ever learned about in the area. Not a bear, not a big cat, not a wolf. It was something bigger, heavier, and it had been watching me. I didn't look back once I reached my car, the relief of safety washing over me as I locked the doors and started the engine. I drove away fast, the forest receding behind me. I never went back to that campsite. I still don't know what was out there, but I know it was real. Not a ghost or monster from a story, but something alive, something dangerous, something that doesn't want people in its territory. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also wild. And sometimes you realize how small and vulnerable you really are when you're out there alone. I had been planning that solo camping trip for over 2 months. After a rough winter of nonstop work and barely any time outdoors, I wanted something that would really clear my head. Something deep in nature, not just a roadside state park or a weekend at a cabin. I needed to walk away from everything. Just me, my pack, and silence. So when May rolled around, I picked a section of trail in the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas, a part that was less popular, not too commercialized, and had no nearby towns. A part where I could be absolutely alone. I didn't tell many people I was going, just left a general plan with a coworker, heading into the Ouachitas for a week, sticking to the trail system, and I'd check in when I got back. No cell service out there, no Garmin or satellite tracker. I liked it that way. I parked at a little turnout near the trailhead late on a Sunday afternoon, well off any main road. It was one of those spots you'd only know about if you'd done your research. No signs, no ranger station. Just a gravel patch with room for 2 cars, maybe 3 if someone didn't mind getting scratched up by brush. Mine was the only one there. The first 2 days were what I expected. The trail was overgrown in places, with low saplings and thorny greenbrier clawing at my legs and pack. But it was beautiful. All green and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring until the bugs start up or a bird finally cuts through it. I hiked slow, maybe 10 miles each day. I had my full pack, food for 5 days, tent, water filter, the usual. I wasn't trying to push distance. I was just trying to let my mind slow down. I kept my phone off. I didn't even check the time. Just woke up with the sun, walked, stopped when I felt like it, and set up camp wherever seemed best. The trail started climbing into rockier terrain on the third day. The trees thinned out a bit, and the views opened up. I found a high spot around midday, a kind of exposed ridge with a small outcrop that looked out over the hills. You could see for miles just rolling green ridges like waves stretching off into haze. I set my pack down and sat on the outcrop for a while, eating a peanut butter wrap and drinking filtered creek water. There were no signs of people anywhere.
No campsites. No rapes.
No carved initials on the trees. It felt untouched. That evening, I pushed a little further and set up camp in a shallow ravine beside a dry stream bed. It was sheltered and quiet. I cleared a few sticks and pine cones, set my tent down, and boiled water for dinner. Just as the light started to go, I heard something that stopped me in the middle of stirring my food. It sounded like something rolling down the hillside behind me, not crashing or thudding, more like small rocks bouncing, quick and then gone. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. The woods were totally still again. Could have been anything. A squirrel, a raccoon, even just loose rock settling. The slope behind my sight was steep and dry. I listened hard, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I finished my dinner and tried to shrug it off. I stayed up until it got properly dark, then crawled into my tent. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard things outside. Not footsteps exactly, just little twigs breaking, a scrape here and there. Once I even sat up and unzipped the door to check. I had my flashlight ready, but the beam just lit up the trees and the dead leaves. No movement, no eyes reflecting, just forest. By the fourth morning, I was feeling tired. My shoulders were sore from the pack, and my legs ached from the terrain. But I didn't want to turn around yet. I had one more night before I planned to loop back toward the car. That day, I veered off the main trail. There was a marked side trail, barely more than a game path, but it looked like it led up to another ridge. I thought maybe I could get another view like the day before. It wasn't marked on my map, but I figured I had the time, so I followed it. That trail climbed fast, switching back a few times and then flattening out along a narrow ridgeline. It was less overgrown than I expected, like someone had walked it recently. I even saw a few old boot prints in the dirt. Just one set, though. Deep heel strikes, heading the same direction I was. It made me wonder if someone else was out there. That evening, I found a flat spot near the edge of the ridge. It was a little open, with thin trees spaced out and a patch of bare ground. Perfect for a tent. I pitched camp, cooked, and sat on a log watching the sun dip behind the hills. Then I saw it. Across the ravine from me, maybe 150 yards away, I saw a man standing still. He was between two trees, partially hidden, but I could clearly see the shape of his body. He wasn't moving. He wasn't walking or adjusting gear or doing anything someone normally does at a campsite. He was just standing there, facing my direction. I stared at him for a long time, trying to decide if he was real or if it was just a trick of the light. The sun was low, orange, and casting weird shadows, but I could see him clearly enough. His clothes were dark. He wasn't wearing a pack. Then he moved, just a small step back into the trees, and vanished. My heart was beating like I'd just run uphill. I sat there frozen, holding my spoon, watching that patch of woods for over 10 minutes. Nothing moved. No wind.
No birds.
I packed up fast, just stuffed everything into my bare bag, zipped up my tent, and climbed into it with my knife in my hand. I left my boots on. I didn't sleep. Every little sound made me tense up. I lay there for hours, barely blinking, until the sky started to lighten. That morning I didn't eat. I just packed up and started heading back down the ridge. I didn't want to be there anymore. My plan was to make it back to the main trail by midday, then push all the way back to the car if I had the energy. As I walked, I kept checking behind me. Every sound made me jump. Once I thought I heard someone step on a stick behind me, but when I stopped, it was dead quiet. I told myself I was just spooked. Maybe I imagined the man the night before. Maybe it was just a tree stump or a shadow. But I knew that wasn't true. About 2 miles down, the trail crossed a narrow saddle between two hills. That's when I saw something that stopped me dead. There was a pile of rocks right in the middle of the trail, neatly stacked about a foot high like a cairn, but not the kind hikers use to mark trails. This wasn't near any intersection, and it wasn't there the day before. I would have noticed. Next to it was something else. A squirrel, dead. His body was flattened and torn open. Not eaten, just mutilated. His head was gone. I stood there staring at it for maybe a full minute. My skin felt cold, like all my heat had drained out through the soles of my feet. Then I walked around it. I didn't touch anything. I didn't take any pictures. I just walked as fast as I could. I wanted out. The rest of that day was a blur. I made it back to the main trail and pushed hard, barely stopping to drink. My legs were rubber by the time I saw the gravel patch where my car was parked. And as soon as I did, I noticed something that made me stop short again. There were boot prints in the dust around my car. Lots of them. Not mine. I always parked tight to the trees and walked straight onto the trail. These were wider, more spaced out. Deep impressions. Someone had walked around the vehicle several times. Maybe even leaned against it. There was a streak on the window, like a hand had been dragged across the glass. But the car was locked. My keys were still in my pocket. Nothing was broken. Nothing stolen. I got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. When I got to cell service, I called my coworker and told him I'd gotten back a day early. I didn't tell him the details. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. Whoever that was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching me. They were waiting. They followed me without me even knowing. And they wanted me to know they'd been there. That squirrel, the stacked rocks, the prints near my car, that was deliberate. It's been almost a year since then. I haven't gone on another solo trip. I still hike, still camp, but always with someone else. Always somewhere with other people nearby. I got a satellite communicator too, because what happened out there, whatever it was real. And the scariest part wasn't that I saw someone. It's that I didn't see them again after that. And they saw everything. Started as a quick solo getaway. No one was free that weekend, and I had a new pack I wanted to break in. I'd done plenty of solo trips before. I'm careful, experienced, and usually over-prepared. I pick safe areas, leave my itinerary with someone, and stay within my limits. I'm not one of those people you read about getting rescued because they tried to summit something in sneakers. I follow the rules. This trip was supposed to be easy. I picked a remote but manageable loop in northern Idaho, about 28 miles total, with several established backcountry sites along the way. It followed a creek, climbed a ridge, and looped back down through a thick forest area before reconnecting with the gravel access road. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday, hike in about 8 miles and camp the first night by the creek, hike another 12 or so Saturday to the ridge, and then finish the loop Sunday morning. I even had the Monday off in case something delayed me. No real elevation gain. Weather looked fine. Mosquitoes were supposed to be bad, but I could handle that. I drove up early Friday morning, parked at the small trailhead lot. It was empty, and hit the trail a little after 9 a.m. I felt good. The trail was clear and well-maintained, with sunlight cutting through the trees and the steady sound of the creek nearby. I saw a few animal tracks, deer mostly, and maybe some older bear scat, but nothing fresh. There was no cell signal once I got about 2 miles in, but that was expected. Around mile 7, I passed a small abandoned-looking hunter's shack maybe 30 yards off the trail. Just a collapsed roof, some rotted planks, and an old rusted barrel. Nothing unusual. There are tons of those kinds of things in the woods if you look. I stopped and snapped a picture with my phone, but didn't poke around. I wasn't there for that. I reached my first campsite by 3:30 p.m. A nice clearing near the creek with a stone fire ring and some old logs someone had dragged over as benches. It looked used but clean. No trash or anything like that. I set up my tent facing the water, filtered some creek water to top off my bottles, and settled in. I cooked dinner, dehydrated chili and rice, ate it slow, and watched the light drop behind the trees. No bugs yet, surprisingly. I didn't bother with a fire. It was quiet. Too quiet. That's a cliche, but it felt true. I'd been in plenty of backcountry areas before, and there's usually some distant bird calls, the occasional chipmunk rustling, insects clicking. But after the sun dipped behind the trees, everything just went dead silent. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe the temperature dropped too fast or something, but it gave me a weird feeling. I brushed it off. I turned in around 9 p.m. I sleep light when I camp, so every gust of wind or twig crack tends to wake me. That first night, though, I only woke once. It was around 2 a.m., and I heard this very soft crunching outside. Not close, maybe 40 feet away. Something was moving slowly through the woods. I stayed still, listening. It didn't seem big. Not a bear, more like a deer. The sound moved past and faded. I rolled over and fell back asleep. The next morning was normal. I made oatmeal and coffee, packed up, and hit the trail by 8 a.m. The day's hike was longer, about 12 miles, but I felt strong. There were some switchbacks as the trail climbed toward the ridge. I stopped for lunch near a dry gully and noticed something weird. A small tree with deep horizontal scratches about chest height. Not claw marks, more like cuts. Clean, parallel lines, spaced evenly. Almost like someone had raked a blade across the bark 4 or 5 times. I checked for any sap or recent damage, but the cuts looked maybe a few days old. Again, I shrugged it off. I've seen weirder things. I kept hiking. Around 3 p.m., I reached the ridgeline, big views, warm sun, and a strong breeze. I found the second campsite about half a mile down the other side. Another established spot with a fire ring, more logs to sit on, and a view of a narrow valley below. I was about 20 miles in at this point, and I hadn't seen a single person since I parked. That wasn't unusual for that area, but I remember thinking how isolated it felt. I set up camp again, filtered more water from a small spring nearby, and took my boots off to air my feet out. My plan was to relax, eat early, and get to bed before the bugs came out. But around 5 p.m., I noticed something off. Not heard, asterisk notice star. It was the trees. The breeze had died down, but the trees on the far side of the valley were moving, like swaying. Not all of them, just a few. Too much for the still air. I watched for a while, trying to make sense of it. There was no pattern. A cluster of 3 or 4 trees would move slightly, then go still. A minute later, another group further to the right would do the same. It was subtle, like someone brushing past them from below, just enough to make the trunks flex. I tried to tell myself it was wind currents or maybe an animal on the slope. Elk, maybe. I forced myself to ignore it. I cooked dinner, cleaned up, and tried to focus on the view. I read a few chapters from a paperback I'd brought and got in the tent as it got dark. That night I couldn't sleep. There was no sound again, just total silence. My ears strained against the quiet. I lay on my side, facing the tent wall, heart ticking a little faster than usual. Sometime after midnight, I heard the first noise. A rock, small, maybe fist-sized, tumbling down the slope above me. It bounced once near the edge of camp, then another one, then nothing. 15 minutes later, a light thud, then again. Not close, but moving closer, like someone lightly stepping on soft ground, waiting a while, then taking another step. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't reach for my light. I just lay there, frozen. My brain kept cycling through explanations. Deer, porcupine, coyote, but none of them made sense. I've heard animals move through camp before. This didn't sound like that. It sounded careful. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke with a jolt just after 4 a.m. and it was still dark, but the noises had stopped. When I got up at dawn, the camp looked untouched. Nothing had moved, but I did notice something. A faint shoe print, maybe half of one, near the edge of camp. It was in the soft dirt between 2 stones. It wasn't mine, pointed toward the tent. I didn't eat. I packed up in record time and hit the trail before 6 a.m. The last day should have been easy, about 8 miles downhill through thick woods and back to the car. But from the minute I stepped back onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking behind me. The trail curved often, and the woods were dense with underbrush. Plenty of places someone or something could stop and watch from. 3 miles in, I found another one of those scratched trees. Same pattern. Clean lines, parallel, too even to be random. Then another one a mile later. And another 100 yards after that. The last one had a long strand of what looked like paracord tied around the base. Frayed and sun-bleached. That's when I started jogging. I don't run with a full pack. But that morning I didn't care. I kept going as fast as I could. Pushing through branches, hopping rocks, trying not to twist an ankle. I just wanted out. I wanted to see the car. I needed the trailhead sign. Civilization. Noise. I didn't hear the last person behind me. I felt them. It was maybe a mile from the trailhead, and I'd slowed down because the terrain had flattened out. I was walking fast, head down, when I suddenly just knew. Someone was behind me. Not close, but not far either. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I started speed walking, then jogging again. I took out my multi-tool from my belt pouch and held it. Not that it would have helped much. With half a mile left, I heard a branch snap behind me. Loud. Too loud to be nothing. I broke into a full run. The trailhead came into view like a dream. My car was the only one still parked there. I didn't stop to check behind me. I just sprinted straight to the driver's side, threw my pack in, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute panting. Windows up, doors locked, heart going a mile a minute. The woods behind the lot were still. No sound, no movement. But I knew something had followed me. I started the car and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 30 miles out, where I went straight into the bathroom and sat on the floor for 10 minutes just to breathe. I checked my pack, my pockets, everything.
No tracker.
No weird markings. Nothing left behind. Just that one photo I took of the old shack and the memory of those cleanly scratched trees. I filed no report. What would I have said? Someone maybe followed me in the woods for 2 days? It wasn't illegal. It's public land.
No proof.
No damage. Nothing stolen. But I knew. Someone else had been out there. Watching. Waiting. Maybe more than one person. Maybe living out there permanently. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when I finally found the small clearing I'd been searching for all afternoon. The forest around me was dense with tall pine and spruce, their branches heavy and dark against the orange-pink sky. I was miles from the nearest road, deep into the wilderness, and the thought made the hairs on my arms stand up. This was exactly the kind of place I wanted for my solo camping trip. Quiet, remote, and free of people. I needed this break. A chance to disconnect from the constant noise of the city, from the endless demands of work and daily life. I dropped my backpack down with a thud and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint smoky scent from a campfire someone must have had here recently. I hadn't seen any other campers on my hike, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to clear the spot and set up camp before darkness fully settled. The fading daylight made the forest seem almost serene, but I was aware how quickly that could change. I pulled out my small folding saw and started trimming a few low branches and clearing dead leaves and twigs from the ground. My tent was light, just a one-person model, easy to set up and pack away quickly. After about 20 minutes, I had a reasonably flat, clean patch ready. The ground was soft but firm, and I noticed the earth smelled slightly wet, probably from last night's rain. The sky was almost completely dark now, with just a little blue lingering near the horizon. It was time to get the fire going. I gathered some dry sticks and small branches for kindling, then larger pieces of wood for the main fire. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches, but I was careful to avoid anything damp or green. Using my lighter and a bit of dry tinder I'd brought, I managed to get the fire going with a small flicker of flame that soon grew steady and warm. The crackling fire threw shadows on the surrounding trees, making them look like giant, moving figures in the dark. I felt a flicker of unease, a reminder that the woods were alive with unseen things. I set up my tent next to the fire, arranging the stakes carefully and securing the rainfly. My sleeping bag was laid out inside, ready for a cold night. The temperature was already dropping. The forest nights could get bitter even in late summer. I had packed well, extra layers, a thermos of hot tea, some canned food, and a small first aid kit. Still, the isolation made me feel exposed. I sat back on a rock watching the flames dance. The forest around me was dark now, but the firelight gave me a small bubble of comfort. I knew the animals were out there, the rustling sounds, the occasional snapping of a twig, the soft scurrying of smaller creatures. Nothing was close enough to see clearly, but I knew they were there. Deer probably, maybe a fox or two. I was used to being careful about food and scents, never leaving anything edible out, storing everything tightly. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, I started thinking about the hike back tomorrow. I'd planned a loop that would bring me back to the trailhead by late afternoon. The weather forecast was clear, no rain expected. Still, being out here alone had its risks. I wasn't reckless, though. I checked in with a friend before I left, told her exactly where I'd be and when I expected to be back. If I didn't check in by a certain time, she was supposed to alert the ranger station. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the ground cold through the thin tent floor. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a coyote, the rustle of leaves. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the warmth from the small fire pit outside my tent's entrance. But the isolation gnawed at me. Around midnight, the sounds outside changed. The normal forest noises faded, replaced by something different. Heavy footsteps on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or some other large animal. But then the footsteps seemed too heavy, and the rhythm too steady, like someone was walking close by, just outside the reach of the firelight. I lay very still, straining to listen. The sounds stopped for a moment, then started again, but this time from a different direction. My heart started to pound, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I told myself it was probably a hiker or hunter moving through the woods. Maybe the park was bigger than I thought, and someone else was nearby. Still, I hadn't heard or seen a soul all day. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent door, peering out into the darkness. The fire had almost died down to embers, and the woods beyond the small clearing were black. I shone the beam into the trees, but saw nothing except the twisting branches and shadows. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't want to show fear, but I felt the hair on my neck rise. I closed the tent and zipped it back up, clutching my small hunting knife inside my jacket. I debated putting out the fire to avoid attracting anyone, but then I remembered the cold. Better to have a fire than freeze. The rest of the night passed with unease, every sound amplified and suspicious. I kept the knife close and my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep much, instead listening to the forest, waiting for dawn. When morning finally broke, the sky was a dull gray, the sun blocked by thick clouds. I made a quick breakfast of canned beans warmed over the small fire, then packed up my camp. As I packed, I noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth around the clearing, big, heavy boots, not mine. Someone else had been here during the night. The prints were recent, the soil still soft. I felt a cold pit in my stomach. Who else was out here? The nearest ranger station was miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. I debated turning back immediately, but decided I had to stick to my plan. Heading back through the forest might be safer than lingering. As I broke camp, I kept my eyes peeled for signs. Broken branches, discarded trash, or anything that might tell me who was nearby. The footprints led away from the clearing toward the deeper woods. I started hiking back on the trail, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The woods felt different now, more oppressive. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. I kept glancing behind me, imagining shapes moving in the underbrush. Hours passed with only the sounds of my own footsteps and breathing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods off the trail. My breath caught. I froze, scanning the tree line. A large, wild animal? Possibly a bear? I'd heard there were black bears in the region, usually shy and avoiding humans, but I wasn't taking chances. I slowly reached for my bear spray from my pack, careful not to make sudden moves. The growl came again, louder this time. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. I saw nothing at first, then caught a glimpse of a large, dark shape moving between the trees. It was big, bigger than a deer, and it moved with a heavy, loping gait. I kept moving slowly back onto the trail, making noise to try to scare it off, stomping my feet, clapping my hands. The growls faded, replaced by rustling. The animal must have retreated. My heart was racing. I knew I couldn't outrun a bear, but I was prepared to fight if necessary. I kept the bear spray ready and made sure my flashlight was steady. I kept hiking, always alert, until I finally reached a small ranger checkpoint about 6 miles down the trail. It was a simple wooden kiosk with maps and emergency instructions. A faint light glowed inside from a small cabin where a ranger was supposed to be stationed during the day. I waited until the ranger appeared, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and tired eyes. I told him what happened, showing him the footprints and describing the sounds. He nodded seriously and told me that some hunters had been reported in the area recently, and that wildlife was acting unusually. He gave me his radio frequency in case I needed help on the way back to my car. Relieved but still shaken, I headed the last mile to the parking lot where my car was. The sun was setting again, and the forest seemed less threatening in the fading daylight. I drove home slowly, still processing what had happened. The isolation, the footsteps in the night, the unknown presence lurking nearby. It all reminded me how wild and unpredictable the wilderness really is. Camping alone was something I'd done many times before, but this trip showed me the line between solitude and danger can be very thin. I don't know what made me choose that particular patch of forest to camp in. It wasn't on a trail map. It wasn't near any landmark. I'd been hiking solo for the better part of a week through a stretch of Appalachian foothills in northern Georgia. I was using some old Forest Service maps I got from a guy I knew who worked maintenance for a fire tower station, and this section had always caught my eye. It was marked only by a faint dotted line, like a forgotten trail, and it was labeled Cut Line, Abandoned. That was the only name it had. Cut Line. No scenic label. No nearby trailhead. Just a dashed line cutting clean through a block of topography. I'd walked the major trails in this area before, Blood Mountain, Coosa, Vogel, but this line veered way off the maintained paths. There were no reviews about it online, no signs, no markers. I guess I was just curious. I had the gear, the time, and the mood. I wasn't looking for anything magical, just quiet, space, and something that made me feel like I was off the grid. It was the 3rd week of October. The leaves were deep into their change, mostly orange and gold with patches of blood red. The air was cool but not cold. I had my tent, a decent stove, freeze-dried meals, plenty of water purification tablets, and a reliable Garmin unit with satellite texting. I wasn't reckless. I had done enough backcountry camping to know better. The first day on the cut line felt normal enough. I picked it up where it intersected a fire road. It was really just a corridor cleared decades ago, probably to run power lines or as a fire break, though now it was overgrown in parts and sunken with erosion in others. The underbrush had crept back in, but you could still tell where the cut was like a scar across the forest. There was no sign of recent use, no boot prints, no tire marks, no trash. In one way, it was perfect. I set up camp in a flat clearing just before dusk. There were tall pines on either side of the corridor and dense brush beyond them. I pitched my tent under the curve of a hemlock, cooked some chili mac, and sat listening to the wind comb through the trees. It was quiet, dead quiet, that kind of silence that feels thick. I remember thinking that even the usual forest sounds, the rustle of small animals, the call of birds, seemed absent. I tried not to dwell on that. I figured maybe I was just in a patch of woods with fewer critters. Or maybe I was just so used to the background noise of trails and traffic that the silence felt sharper. I didn't sleep well, though. I kept waking up. Not from noise, but the lack of it. It's hard to explain. Sometimes when everything is too quiet, your ears start hunting for something to hear, and that can get in your head. By morning, I was already considering moving back to one of the established trails. Not because I was scared or anything, just because something felt off. I told myself maybe I was just not in the right mindset. Maybe I wasn't in the mood for this kind of solitude. Still, I pushed forward along the cut line. The trail, or what was left of it, dipped into a low valley filled with thick laurel. I bushwhacked for an hour, finally finding the corridor again where it climbed sharply up a ridge. That climb was brutal. My legs burned, and I had to stop every 20 steps to breathe. Halfway up, I found something strange. It was an old tarp, brown and faded, tucked between two rocks under a pine. It had been there a long time, stiff from weather and dirt, mostly buried under leaf litter. Beside it, a small pile of rusted cans, beans, peaches, one unlabeled, and a blackened metal cup. Nothing fresh, no packs, no signs of people, just remnants. At first, I thought maybe it was an old hunting camp, but it didn't look right. No fire pit, no cleared area, no bones. Just the tarp, the cans, the cup. I moved on, trying to ignore the weight in my gut. I reached the top of the ridge by late afternoon and made camp again, this time in a clearing with a partial view of the valley below. That night, the wind changed. It picked up just after sunset and carried with it a smell that made my stomach tighten. It was faint, but it was there. Something rotten. Not like garbage, more like animal decay, but sharper and not consistent. Came and went like it was drifting with the breeze. I checked all around camp with my headlamp, but I couldn't find anything. No dead animal, no tracks.
No scat.
That night, sleep was even harder. I kept thinking I heard twigs snapping. Not close, far off, but steady, like something walking in circles. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe even a bear, but I've been in bear country before, and this didn't feel the same. The noise wasn't curious. It wasn't searching. It was just moving. At one point around 2 a.m., I heard something heavy shifting against the side of my tent. Not clawing or scratching, just weight pressing against the fabric for half a second before releasing. I shot upright, hard in my throat, clutching my knife, but when I flicked on my headlamp, there was nothing.
No marks.
No tracks, just the tent swaying a little in the wind. By morning, I had made up my mind to turn back. I didn't care how curious I was about the cut line. Something about this place was wrong. Not haunted, not cursed, just wrong in a very real, physical way, like the land itself had been disturbed and never healed. I started heading back down the ridge, moving faster than usual. I barely stopped to eat, just protein bars while I walked. The sky was overcast, the air heavy, and the silence hadn't lifted. In fact, it felt heavier. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to swallow sound. Even my own footfalls seemed muffled.
No squirrels. No birds.
Just me and the trees. It was around midday when I saw the man. He was standing just beyond the corridor, 20 yards into the brush, still facing me, dressed in dark clothes, what looked like a black rain jacket and cargo pants. His face was obscured by the hood. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't moving, just standing. I froze, stared, waited for him to speak, but he didn't.
No wave.
No call, just stillness. I raised my hand slowly, half a wave, unsure what to do. He didn't respond. After nearly a full minute, I turned and started walking again. Faster now. I didn't look back. I don't know why. I just felt like I shouldn't. I walked for over an hour, not stopping, not checking the map, just following the corridor back toward where I had started. I told myself maybe it was a hunter. Maybe he was just surprised to see someone out there. Then I saw the tarp again. Same spot, same rusted cans, same cup, which made no sense. I hadn't circled. I hadn't turned. I had been moving in a straight line. I checked my Garmin. The breadcrumb trail showed my movement as a loop, not a straight path. Somehow I had doubled back. That's when the panic started. I stopped thinking clearly. I started sweating even though it was cold. I pulled out my compass and tried to match it to the terrain, but everything looked different. The ridgelines didn't match the map. I couldn't find the same valleys I'd passed through. Even the trees looked off, too uniform, like a plantation of pines set decades ago. I kept moving, trying to stay rational, telling myself the GPS was glitching, that I was tired, that I'd just misread the slope. But every time I picked a direction, it seemed to lead me back to that same tarp. I set up camp again that night, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. It got dark fast, and I didn't want to risk moving without light. I kept my knife in my hand, slept in short, anxious bursts. My water was running low. I rationed the last of my food. In the early morning, I heard movement again, this time closer, crisp footsteps in the brush. Not running, just walking, deliberate. I didn't dare move. I just stayed curled in my bag, listening. Then silence. When I unzipped the tent at dawn, there were boot prints, fresh, only a few feet from where I had slept. No other signs, just the prints, deep and clean. I packed everything as fast as I could and moved. The next 2 days blurred together. I walked without breaks, ignoring trails, ignoring the cut line. I used the sun, the slope, anything I could to push west. The terrain got rougher, steeper hills, thicker brush, but I kept pushing. Eventually, I found a creek and followed it. That's a basic rule in survival. Find running water and follow it downstream. I figured it would lead to a road, a trail, something. Took another full day, but it worked. I came out onto a logging road, muddy and rutted, but real. A few hours later, a pickup truck came by, and I flagged it down. I didn't ask where I was. I didn't care. I just asked him to take me to the nearest town. That was 8 months ago. I haven't been camping since. I haven't opened the Forest Service maps. The Garmin is still in my drawer, untouched. I don't tell this story often, and when I do, I leave most of it out. But here's the part one never skip, the part one can't explain no matter. I had a 3-day weekend, and I wanted to get out of the city for a bit. I didn't have a plan, really. Just wanted to camp somewhere quiet, hike a little, sit by a fire, eat some simple food, and sleep in the woods. That was it.
No distractions.
No phone, no people, just some air that didn't smell like exhaust fumes and sidewalks that weren't crowded with noise. I needed it. I chose a spot about 4 hours north from where I lived. It wasn't a national park or some heavily maintained campground, just state forest land where backcountry camping was allowed. I'd been there once before with a friend a couple years ago. I remembered it being quiet, with a lake not too far from the forest trail. It seemed like the right choice. I packed what I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, stove, basic tools, bear spray, first aid, headlamp, and left early Friday morning. I parked at a trailhead that wasn't exactly popular. It had a dirt lot that could fit maybe 4 cars. Mine was the only one there. That was a good sign for me. I signed in at the little metal register at the trail start, just so someone would know I was in there, and set off. The hike in wasn't bad. Maybe 4 miles to the lake, I remembered. It was late spring, and the trees were full but not choking. There were a few bugs but not clouds of them. The sun filtered down through green leaves, and the ground was soft but dry. I had a good pace, and I reached the lake by early afternoon. The spot I picked for camp was just off the northern shore. Flat ground, pine cover, and a little rise that gave me a view of the water through the trees. No fire ring, which was good, meant it hadn't been used a lot. I set up my tent, got my sleeping pad and bag rolled out, and then walked down to the lake to filter some water. The lake was calm, glassy even, not a ripple. Felt good to be there, peaceful, like I'd hit reset. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, dehydrated rice and beans, ate slowly, and then sat against a log until it got dark. I didn't make a fire. I didn't need one. The moon was already rising and the night air was still. I crawled into my tent and slept hard. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I woke up early, before the sun was fully up, to the sound of something moving near the lake. Not loud, just some crunching leaves or twigs. I stayed still, listening. Stopped quickly. I figured it was probably a deer or something. No big deal. I got up, made oatmeal and coffee, and packed a small day bag to do a loop hike that went around the lake and then up into some ridge trails. I was gone for most of the day, hiking, stopping for lunch, taking my time. When I got back to camp in the late afternoon, the first thing I noticed was that the corner of my tent was collapsed. One of the stakes had been pulled up, and the pole had slipped. My first thought was wind, even though it had been calm. Or maybe I didn't stake it well. But when I got closer, something didn't sit right. The stake was pulled completely out and placed right next to the tent. It wasn't like it had been yanked and flung. It was just lying there, clean, like someone had pulled it up and put it down neatly. That bothered me more than I expected it to. Inside, nothing was missing. My gear was untouched, but that made it worse somehow. If it had been a bear or raccoon, there would have been a mess. If it had been wind, the stake would have still been half in the ground or bent. This felt deliberate, quiet, controlled. I checked the area, walking in a wide circle around my camp, looking for boot prints or broken branches or anything that might suggest someone had been there. But the ground was dry, and there weren't many signs. Nothing obvious. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was wind after all. Or maybe some animal had snagged it and it just looked clean by accident. I forced myself to believe that. Still, that night, I did something I don't normally do. I moved my food bag and stove farther away than usual. I also put the rain fly on my tent even though there wasn't any chance of rain. I zipped everything up tight and kept my headlamp and knife right next to me in the tent. I didn't sleep well. Every noise seemed louder than normal. Every creak or rustle snapped me awake. But the night passed. When I stepped out of my tent at first light, the camp looked exactly as I left it. No new prints, no signs of disturbance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The third day, I decided not to hike far. I wanted to stay near camp, maybe fish a little at the lake, maybe read. I needed to relax. I kept scanning the woods though, like I expected to see someone watching from the trees. But nothing, just silence and wind. I tried to convince myself I was just rattled from being alone too long. That afternoon, I went to gather some dead branches and downed wood. I wanted a fire that night to feel more grounded. While I was about 50 yards from camp, I found something strange. It was a piece of blue nylon, like from a jacket or backpack, wedged in a branch. It looked torn, frayed on one edge, like it had been caught there. I looked around, wondering if there were more signs of someone passing through. That's when I noticed the tree. It was just off to the side of the path I'd taken. A tall birch with a clean, straight trunk, and carved into the bark, low to the ground, were two parallel lines about 6 inches long, with a short horizontal slash connecting them at the bottom. It almost looked like an H without the top bar. It didn't look fresh, but it wasn't old either. Maybe a few weeks. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out why it unsettled me. It wasn't a trail marker. It wasn't the usual sort of thing hikers left behind. Felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, but deliberate. I broke off the piece of blue nylon and brought it back to camp. That night, I made a fire as planned. I sat near it for a long time, more for the comfort than the heat. I watched the flames and listened to the woods. At some point, well after dark, I thought I heard a sound. Something fast, like a single step on dry leaves, then nothing. I turned off my headlamp and sat completely still. The fire crackled behind me, and my ears strained in the dark. Nothing. Then, maybe a minute later, another faint sound. Closer, like a footfall, then silence. I stood up slowly, knife in hand. I scanned the dark beyond the firelight but saw nothing.
No hay cine.
No movement. I couldn't tell if it was animal or human, but I felt it again, that sense of being watched. I didn't sleep much that night. I dozed in short, shallow bursts, every creak outside pulling me awake. I kept the knife under my pillow and my headlamp strapped to my wrist. At sunrise, I packed everything. I ate a protein bar while breaking down the tent, rolled everything up tight, and got my pack ready. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to be out of there. I didn't feel safe anymore. I started hiking out, trying not to look back too much. About halfway to the car, maybe 2 miles from camp, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was another tree with that same carving on it, those 2 vertical lines with the horizontal slash. This one was fresher. I could see the pale wood beneath the bark. It hadn't been there 3 days ago when I passed this way. I was sure of it. I stood there frozen for a moment, scanning the trail ahead and behind. Nothing moved. I didn't run. That would have made me more vulnerable if someone was watching. But I moved faster, tighter, more focused. Every branch snap, every squirrel darting through brush made me flinch. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car still there, untouched, I felt a huge wave of relief. But it didn't last. As I walked around to unlock the driver's door, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a piece of torn paper, maybe from a small notebook. On it, drawn in black ink, was that same damn symbol, 2 vertical lines and a horizontal slash connecting them at the bottom. Nothing else. No words. No name. Just that. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. It's been a few weeks now. I haven't told many people about it. I didn't file a report. I didn't know what to say. Someone was near my camp and drew a weird symbol. They'd just nod and move on. I still have the piece of paper. It's in a drawer by my desk. I look at it sometimes. I've tried searching online for what it means, but I haven't found anything solid. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it was someone else's marker, some hunter or survivalist or just a loner out there like me. But I don't think so. What gets me is the silence, the neatness, the clean stake, the paper on the windshield. It all felt so practiced. And here's the part that really bothers me. Whoever it was, if it was someone, they hiked 4 miles into the woods, stayed quiet near my camp for at least one night, marked trees near my trail, and found my car. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me, but they wanted me to know they were there. That's worse in some ways, because they chose to let me leave. I was somewhere in north-central Colorado, about 15 miles west of a small town called Walden. I had done some dispersed camping out in that area before, mostly in the Route National Forest. The land up there is rugged, dry, and open in some parts, with stretches of thick pine and aspen groves in others. I had a long weekend off from work, and I wanted something quiet and away from people. It was the middle of August, and the weather forecast showed no rain, just cool nights and warm, dry days. I loaded up my old 4Runner with my gear, some food, a water container, my sleeping bag, pad, stove, bear canister, and basic tools. I kept a sidearm in the glove box, which I usually took with me for protection. Not because I expected trouble, but because I liked the idea of being prepared. I wasn't new to this. I'd camped alone a lot over the years, and I always made sure someone knew where I was headed. I even left a printed map on the kitchen counter for my brother, circled in red where I'd be camping, and texted him when I got there. The plan was simple. 3 nights, no trails, no campgrounds. Just park somewhere off a rough forest road, hike in a mile or so, find a quiet clearing, set up camp, and unwind. I brought a paperback book, a small notepad, and my little old Garmin GPS. My phone usually lost signal a few miles out of town, but I brought it anyway to use as a camera and flashlight backup. I got to the area around noon on Friday and drove slowly down a narrow dirt road that snaked through the forest. There were a few pull-offs along the way, mostly just wide enough for one car. I passed a couple of campers with RVs closer to the beginning of the road, but further in, it was empty. After a few more miles, I found a turnout that didn't look like it had been used much. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and listened. Dead quiet. Just a light breeze moving through the pine trees. No vehicles, no distant voices, no airplanes, just how I liked it. I grabbed my pack, locked the 4Runner, and started hiking uphill through the trees. I wasn't following a trail, but I had the terrain map in my GPS and had scouted a flat area near a small meadow using satellite view earlier that week. It was about a 25-minute hike, not too steep, and when I got there, the place looked perfect. A small clearing in the trees with soft ground, enough light coming through, and no sign of recent use. No fire pits, no trash, no footprints. I set up my tent facing away from the meadow with my back to a stand of aspen trees. I like facing into the woods when I'm in camp. Makes me feel less exposed. I spent the afternoon collecting some deadfall for a small campfire later, eating a late lunch and just relaxing. I read a bit, stretched out on my sleeping pad, and listened to the breeze. Felt good being out there. That first evening passed without much of anything happening. The fire crackled for a bit while I warmed a can of chili, and I went to bed early. The air was cool, probably in the 40s, but I had the right gear for it. Somewhere in the night, I woke up briefly because I heard a rustling in the leaves outside. I figured it was a deer or maybe a chipmunk nosing around. I always keep my food in a bear canister well away from camp, so I wasn't too worried. I lay there for a few minutes, listening, but it stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. The second day was more of the same, hiking around the nearby ridges, exploring the meadow, and doing a bit of map reading. I didn't see anyone. I found some elk tracks near the edge of the clearing and some very old, sun-bleached bones, probably from a deer that had been picked clean long ago. I took some photos of wildflowers and the jagged hills in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept looking over my shoulder without meaning to, like my body was on alert even though my mind hadn't caught up to it yet. That night, I stayed up a little later, writing in my notepad by the light of my headlamp. I had a small fire again, burned the last of the wood I'd gathered. I kept thinking I was hearing faint snapping of twigs far off in the trees, but the wind was moving again, and it could have been anything. I remember thinking, "You're just being stupid," and eventually crawled into my tent. I fell asleep a bit restless, and sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a distinct sound, something heavy stepping on dry twigs, and it was close. Not close like 50 yards away, but more like just outside my tent. I froze. My first thought was bear, but bears don't usually walk slowly and deliberately. Whatever this was, it moved carefully. Then it stopped. No huffing, no breathing sounds, just stillness. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even move. I just lay there, barely breathing, for at least 20 minutes. It never came any closer, but it also didn't move away for a while. When I finally heard it moving again, it was slower, off toward the meadow. I sat up then, clutching the small knife I kept near my bag, and stayed awake until sunrise. That morning, I walked the area around my tent. No bear tracks, no sign of claws or paw prints, but there were footprints, human ones, a single set, boot prints, headed from the tree line toward the edge of my tent and then away again, into the woods toward the meadow. I followed them a few steps before they disappeared in the pine needles. The spacing was weird, wide steps like someone trying to be quiet or walking carefully. The prints weren't there the day before. I was sure of it. I took photos, marked the location in my GPS, and packed up camp immediately. I didn't hike straight back to the truck. I took a longer loop to see if I could spot anything or anyone. Nothing, just trees and old logs and some distant bird calls. When I reached the road and saw my 4Runner still there, untouched, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my pack in and drove back down the road faster than I probably should have. I got a hotel that night in town and checked my photos. The boot prints were clear, maybe size 11 or 12. Tread looked like a work boot. I kept zooming in, looking for something I missed. I didn't sleep much that night either. When I got home, I told my brother everything. We compared the map I'd left him to the GPS data I brought back. Then something clicked. The clearing where I camped, it wasn't just any random flat spot. According to an old Forest Service layer we found online, that exact meadow had once been a fire crew base camp in the late 90s, used briefly during a wildfire that had burned through the ridge behind it. Temporary tents, gear drops, portable toilets, all cleared out after the fire. But sometimes old campsites like that still get marked on niche forums or shared by people who like remote camping. Places like that attract certain kinds of people. I posted the boot photos on a couple of outdoor forums under a fake username, asking if anyone had seen similar prints in the route area. No one had, but one guy messaged me saying something that still gives me chills. He said he had camped alone just north of there 2 years earlier and woke up one night to the sound of someone breathing near his tent. Not walking, not talking, just steady, slow breathing. When he unzipped his tent in the morning, there were no prints, nothing, but his gear had been moved, not taken, just slightly shifted. like someone was letting him know they'd been there. He never went back either. I still camp, but not alone anymore, and not in places I haven't thoroughly researched. I installed a trail cam system that links to a satellite unit. I take a lockbox and never leave my vehicle unmonitored for long. That trip changed how I think about the woods, not because of bears or mountain lions, but because I realized that out in the middle of nowhere, hours from help, the real danger might just be someone else who chooses to be out there. Someone who watches, follows, waits, and never says a word. And the worst part? They didn't need to say anything. I still heard them loud and clear. I had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip, a chance to get away from the city and clear my head. I had done plenty of hiking and camping before, nothing fancy, but I knew the basics. I had a good tent, a reliable sleeping bag rated for the cold, a small stove, enough food and water, and all the usual gear. The forest I chose was a popular one, but with a section known to be quiet and less traveled. I wanted peace, solitude, and to test myself. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my car at the trailhead. The sun was still high, the air warm but starting to cool as the day faded. I checked my backpack one last time and started down the narrow dirt trail that led into the thick woods. The forest was dense. Tall pines and oaks crowded in close, their leaves rustling softly with the wind. The smell of pine needles and earth filled the air. The trail was well marked at first but soon narrowed. I was careful to stay on the path. I kept an eye on the small map I'd printed out, making sure I was headed toward the camping area I had marked, a spot by a small creek about 3 miles in. The walk wasn't difficult, just a steady uphill climb through the trees and over some rocks. By the time I reached the creek, the sun was low, casting long shadows. I found the spot I wanted, an open clearing with soft grass and a flat space perfect for pitching a tent. There were a few old fire rings nearby and signs that people had camped here before, but it was quiet now. I liked that. I set down my pack and began to unpack. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure in the soft soil. Then I gathered some dry wood and kindling from around the clearing. I wanted a fire for warmth and to cook my dinner. As I worked, the sky darkened and the forest noises began. Birds settling in for the night, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The fire was the first comfort. Flames crackled and popped, throwing flickering light on the trees around me. I cooked a simple meal, freeze-dried pasta with some dried vegetables, and ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. The creek bubbled nearby, the water rushing over smooth stones. After cleaning up, I settled into my tent early. I didn't want to waste light, and the temperature was dropping fast. The sleeping bag was warm and cozy, and I lay back to rest. That's when I started to hear it. At first, it was faint, a low, almost imperceptible crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves, far away. I told myself it was just an animal, deer maybe, or a raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The sounds came again, slow, steady steps circling the clearing. I was alone, or so I thought. There was no one else at this remote spot, and cell service was non-existent out here. I checked my phone. It was dead anyway. I told myself to stay calm, to remember that wild animals were common in these woods. But then the sounds got closer. The steps weren't just around the clearing anymore. They were approaching my tent. I froze. My heart pounded. I reached for my flashlight, but I hadn't left it in the tent with me. I had put it by the fire about 20 feet away. I debated whether to get out or stay inside. Then I heard something else. A low snap of a branch, close, too close. The steps paused. Something was standing just outside my tent. I strained my ears. The night was quiet except for the creek and this heavy breathing, or perhaps a low growl. I gripped my pocket knife tightly under my sleeping bag, ready for whatever it was. Minutes passed. The sounds moved away, slow footsteps retreating. I didn't move until I was sure the presence was gone. Sleep did not come easily. Every small noise set me on edge. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt menacing. At dawn, I left the tent and went to the fire ring to start a new fire. The sun filtered through the trees in shafts of light, and the forest was waking up. I inspected the clearing. That's when I saw it. A footprint pressed into the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. It was large, definitely not an animal. The sole had deep treads, like from a hiking boot or work boot. Someone had been here, close to my camp, in the middle of the night. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe I had imagined the sounds. Maybe a bear or other animal made strange noises. But the footprint was real. It was fresh, wet dirt, not dried out yet. I packed quickly and decided to hike out early. But as I gathered my gear, I noticed something else. My small food bag, which I had hung from a tree branch to keep safe from animals, was torn. The bag wasn't empty, but the zipper was shredded and the bag itself had bite marks. Someone, or something, had been messing with my supplies. Panic started to creep in. I had always trusted the forest, but now it felt dangerous. I didn't want to leave my tent unattended, but I didn't want to stay either. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail. The hike back was tense. Every crackle of leaves underfoot sounded like footsteps behind me. I kept turning my head, but saw nothing. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes watching me. About a mile down the trail, I stumbled on something odd. It was a small pile of broken branches, shaped almost like a crude shelter. Someone had been here recently. My skin crawled. I knew I was not alone in the woods. I moved faster now, my breathing heavy, heart racing. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was there, parked exactly where I left it. I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes to catch my breath. But then I noticed something on my windshield. A small, folded note. Hands trembling, I opened it. It was a scrap of paper with a message crudely written in pencil. I stared at the note, shock and fear washing over me. I wanted to call the police, but there was still no cell service. The nearest ranger station was miles away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my doors locked and the engine running. The next morning, I decided not to risk staying any longer. I drove away as fast as I could. Weeks later, I heard from someone who hikes those woods regularly. They told me about a group of people who lived illegally in those forests, scavenging supplies from hikers and campers. They were known to threaten anyone who got too close to their camps. That explained everything. I never went back to those woods, and I never will. The forest isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, the real terror comes not from ghosts or monsters, but from people hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way. This happened 2 years ago in early October. The weather in northern Idaho that time of year is unpredictable, cool during the day, cold at night, and the kind of quiet in the woods that presses down on you like weight. I planned this solo camping trip for a while. I had just wrapped up a brutal few months at work and needed the time away. And more than anything, I just wanted to be out there where no one could reach me. I'd been hiking and camping solo for years. I was confident, overly confident, probably. I'd chosen an area I hadn't explored before, a remote stretch of forest near the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. The trailhead was at the end of a long, rutted forest road, barely a road. Really, I'd researched the area well enough, checked maps, and even called a local ranger station to confirm conditions were decent.
No fires, no closures.
There were fewer visitors this late in the season, but that was what I wanted. I packed carefully. My gear was solid. A 4-season tent, cold weather sleeping bag, stove, extra batteries, water filter, GPS, topo map, and a satellite beacon. I had enough food for 4 nights, though I only planned to stay 3. The plan was simple. Hike 10 miles in, make camp by the lake, stay there 2 nights, then circle back out along a different trail that looped around to the road. When I reached the trailhead, there were no other cars. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the car, and started hiking. The trail was narrow and quiet. Pines lined both sides, thick and tall, with the ground below blanketed in golden needles. A few birds chirped here and there, and I saw deer scat along the path. No bears, no fresh tracks, Took me about 6 hours to reach the lake. The last part of the trail climbed a ridge, then dropped steeply down into a little basin where the lake sat, almost perfectly still. I set up my tent at the far end of the lake, tucked into a small flat patch behind some boulders, not visible from the main trail. I always try to make camp a little out of sight just in case someone else passes through. You never know. That first night was calm, cold but manageable. I made a fire with some dry wood and twigs I found in a fallen tree, cooked a small meal, and sat listening to the wind ripple across the water. No sign of anyone.
No distant voices.
No other fires. Just me. I slept okay, considering. I woke up twice from animal sounds. A coyote howling in the distance once, and what I think was a squirrel rustling under the tarp. Normal stuff. The second day, I didn't hike much. Just walked around the lake, filtered some more water, took photos of the trees changing colors. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way. Clouds rolled in after noon, and the temperature dropped fast. I put on a thermal layer and sat inside the tent for a while, reading. Later that evening, I made some tea and boiled rice with dried vegetables and tuna. I still remember the metallic taste of the water that day, even though it was filtered. That night was when things started to feel strange. It was about 1:30 in the morning, maybe closer to 2, when I woke up suddenly. I don't know what triggered it. Just that weird snap your eyes open feeling you get when your body knows something's off. I laid there listening. There was no sound at first. No wind.
No insects.
Nothing. Then I heard it, very faint footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Slow, steady crunching. Like someone walking carefully on dry needles and twigs. They came from somewhere near the trail, maybe 50 yards out, maybe more. Hard to tell through the trees. They stopped. I stayed completely still. Didn't even breathe loudly. I didn't move my head or unzip the bag. I just laid there in the dark, barely blinking. Nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard it again, one single twig snap. Closer, maybe 30 yards. Then silence. It's not unusual to hear sounds in the woods at night, but this wasn't random animal movement. It had that unmistakable cadence of human steps. And more than that, it had intention. There was a pause between them, like someone was stopping and listening. I laid there for maybe an hour, not sleeping, just waiting. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is daylight starting to seep through the tent walls. It was cloudy, cold, and the fire pit I'd built the day before looked untouched. I checked around the camp, but I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing obvious. But something in me had shifted. I didn't feel comfortable anymore. I thought about packing up and heading out, but it was a long hike back, and the second trail I'd planned to take out was slightly longer, but would lead to a different part of the road where I could loop back to the car. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. Could have been a deer. Could have been a tree creaking. I stayed. That was my mistake. The third day was even colder. I kept busy just to keep my mind from wandering. Walked part of the trail out, checked landmarks on the map, double-checked my GPS. Everything was where it should be. I tried to convince myself I just freaked out the night before. That night, I didn't make a fire, didn't want to draw attention. I ate a cold meal in the tent, sealed everything in my bear canister, and set it away from camp like usual. The forest was dead quiet. I tried sleeping early, but I kept checking my watch, unable to relax. At around 11:45 p.m., I heard something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a metallic clink, like metal on metal. Faint, then nothing, then again closer. My heartbeat started racing. I sat up slowly and unzipped the sleeping bag just enough to reach for my headlamp. I turned it on and clicked it to red light mode to preserve night vision. The tent was zipped. I peeked through the small mesh window. Nothing. Then I heard it again, louder. Asterisk clink asterisk, followed by the unmistakable sound of something tapping or dragging along rock. The fire ring, my stove, my gut dropped. I turned off the light, unzipped the tent just an inch and listened. The sound stopped. I waited. Then, maybe 15 feet away, I heard something move. A rustle, a breath. Someone was there. Not walking, not moving around like an animal. just standing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My mind started racing. My bear spray was next to me. My knife was zipped in a pouch with the rest of my gear. I sat there like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped completely. Nothing, just silence. Somehow, I made it until daylight. When I finally stepped outside the tent, the fire pit was disturbed. My stove had been moved just a few feet but placed upside down almost neatly. The bear canister was untouched, but I noticed something new near the boulders. A strip of blue cloth, like nylon, torn from a jacket or backpack. I don't wear blue. I didn't stay to think it through. I packed up camp in record time, skipped breakfast, and hiked out along the long loop. The whole way, I checked behind me every few minutes. Nothing, not a sound. But the feeling that someone was back there never went away. That trail was rougher than I remembered. A lot of climbing. My legs were burning, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. 6 hours later, I reached the road, and my car wasn't there. I froze. It was the right place, same tree, same bend in the road. But the car was gone. I stood there trying to make sense of it. I wasn't on a popular trail. There was no ranger station here, no tow signs, no reason anyone would have moved it. It hadn't broken down. I had the keys. I walked in circles, trying to see if I was somehow at the wrong trailhead. But everything matched. Then I saw them, tire tracks in the dirt. Mine leading in, and a second set going out. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal, of course. My sat beacon could send an SOS, but that wasn't for this. This wasn't a broken leg. This wasn't hypothermia. This was something else. I followed the road on foot for nearly 3 hours before I saw another car. I flagged it down and the driver let me use their phone. We called the sheriff. They came out, took a statement, looked around, treated it like a stolen vehicle, but I could see in their eyes they didn't really know what to make of it. 3 days later, my car was found. It had been left in a small clearing off another forest road, about 30 miles away. Nothing was taken. Not the change, not the cheap GPS, not the spare gear in the back. But the driver's seat was pushed all the way forward, too far for me, and taped to the rearview mirror was that same blue nylon strap I saw at the lake. They never found anyone.
No fingerprints.
No prints at the campsite. No obvious evidence. The official story is that someone stumbled across the trailhead, found an unlocked car, and decided to mess with a stranger. Maybe some backwoods prankster or weirdo. But that doesn't explain how they found me, how they followed me through 10 miles of trail, how they got that close without making a sound, or how they knew I was alone. I don't camp solo anymore. I still hike, but I stick to busy trails now. Parking lots with It was early September when I decided to go camping alone. I needed a break from everything, work, noise, people. I wanted to be alone with nature, just me and the forest. I'd done this before many times, so I felt confident. I packed my usual gear: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, some food, water, a knife, a headlamp, and my trusted backpack. I made sure I had enough for 3 days. The spot I chose was deep in the national forest, several miles from the nearest road. It was remote, a place I had never been before, which made it all the more appealing. I liked the idea of being far from anything, out in the wild where nothing but trees and silence surrounded me. I started hiking early in the morning. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the trail was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves under my boots. The forest was dense with tall pines and oaks, their branches casting long shadows on the ground. Birds sang here and there, but their songs felt distant and muted in the thick woods. I walked for hours, following the map carefully. I didn't want to get lost. I stopped for breaks, ate some snacks, and drank water from my bottle. Every step brought me deeper into the woods, farther from the noise of civilization. I passed small streams, patches of moss, and fallen logs covered with mushrooms. Around midday, I found a small clearing next to a shallow creek. It was perfect, flat ground, near water, some sun filtering through the trees. I decided to set up camp there. I unpacked my tent and carefully pitched it, making sure it was secure. Then I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire pit. I knew the nights could get cold, so I wanted a fire for warmth and safety. After setting up, I sat by the creek, letting the water run over my fingers. The sound was calming. I ate some canned beans I heated over the fire and drank more water. The forest around me was peaceful, untouched. I felt good, relaxed, and ready for a quiet night. As the afternoon passed, the sun slowly moved west, casting golden light through the trees. I collected more firewood, stacked it neatly beside the fire pit. I checked my gear again, making sure everything was ready for the night. I put away my food carefully in a bear-proof container I carried. I had heard stories about bears and other animals roaming near campsites, so I didn't take any chances. The sky turned orange and pink as the sun set. I lit the fire, watching the flames crackle and dance. The warmth was comforting against the cool air. I sat close to it, feeling the heat on my face, listening to the night sounds slowly waking up, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness grew, I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and turned on my headlamp. I wanted to read for a while, but the light felt too harsh inside the small space. Instead, I lay on my sleeping pad, staring at the tent ceiling, letting my mind drift. That's when I noticed something strange. Outside, beyond the circle of firelight, the woods didn't seem quite right. The usual nighttime noises were there, but there was an odd stillness too, like the forest was holding its breath. The wind had stopped completely. Even the crickets were silent. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as if something unseen was watching. I tried to shake off the feeling and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a twig snapping. It was soft, but sharp. I sat up slowly, listening. Another snap, closer this time. Something was moving out there, in the dark, beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, enough to peek out. The fire was low, just a few glowing embers now. The woods were black shadows. I swept the beam of light through the trees, searching. Nothing. I was alone. I told myself that again. Probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps. Careful, slow, coming closer. I closed the tent flap and sat back down, heart pounding. I tried to calm down, telling myself to relax, but the sound didn't stop. For the next hour, I heard movement in the woods, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but never saw anything. At one point, the fire flickered and went out. The warmth disappeared, and the forest turned cold and dark around me. I quickly used my lighter to reignite it. The flame took, and the circle of light grew again, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I decided not to leave the tent anymore that night. I kept my knife close and my flashlight on the floor beside me. Every noise outside made me jump. The wind never returned, and the night stayed deathly quiet except for those soft, creeping sounds. Around midnight, the noises stopped suddenly. The woods went silent again, so silent I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. I tried to fall asleep but couldn't. Every shadow outside looked like it was moving. I felt trapped in my small tent, the walls pressing in. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack just outside the tent flap. Something heavy hit the ground near my head. My heart jumped to my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it right outside. There, not 10 feet away, something lay on the ground. It was a backpack, old, worn, covered in dirt and leaves. I hadn't seen it before. I didn't recognize it. How did it get here? I stared at it, frozen. My mind raced. Someone had been near my campsite. Someone had left this here. Why? I slowly unzipped the tent door and grabbed the backpack. It was light, almost empty except for a folded map, some cans of food, and a water bottle. The map was old and worn, but the route showed a trail nearby that I hadn't noticed before. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound behind me, a crunching of leaves and a snap of a branch. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the dark. Nothing but trees, but the feeling was overwhelming. Someone had to be out there. I zipped the tent quickly and locked it shut. I sat back down, breathing hard, holding the backpack on my lap. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, but eventually the wood ran out. The cold crept in. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, ready for anything. When dawn finally broke, soft light filtered through the trees. I felt weak and exhausted but relieved. The noises had stopped. The woods were normal again, peaceful. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked innocent in the daylight, but the backpack was still there, next to the fire pit. I grabbed it and checked again. The map caught my attention. The trail it showed was a narrow path that led to a ranger station about 5 miles away. I packed my things quickly. I left no trace but the backpack and fire pit. I started walking toward the ranger station, following the map. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I kept going. About 3 hours later, I saw the ranger station ahead. It was small and empty, but the door was open. Inside, I found a phone and called for help. The ranger arrived soon after, and I told them everything. They told me the area had been searched for days because a group of hikers had gone missing recently. The backpack I found belonged to one of them. The missing hikers were never found, but signs of a struggle were found near the trail. Broken branches, footprints, and scattered gear. I never learned exactly what happened to them or who else was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I was lucky to be alive. The forest that night wasn't haunted by ghosts or monsters, just by something much scarier. Someone or something real and dangerous, hiding just beyond the firelight, waiting in the dark. I didn't plan to be scared. Not really. I thought it would be just another weekend trip out in the woods. I had my gear packed and double-checked: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, maps, compass, first aid kit, everything. I've been camping plenty of times before, alone, with friends, in rain and shine, in summer and fall. I thought I knew what to expect. The plan was simple: a 2-night solo camping trip in a remote forest area I found on a map. It wasn't a popular spot. No marked trails, no official campsites, just dense woods, a small lake marked on the map, and miles of nothing. I wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to practice navigation skills without GPS. I drove out early Saturday morning. The air was crisp and cool, the sun filtering through the thick canopy as I parked my car at a tiny gravel pullout beside a dirt road. No one else was there. Perfect. I shouldered my pack, heavier than I liked but manageable, and set off into the woods. The first few hours were uneventful. I followed a faint animal trail that roughly led toward the lake. The forest was thick with pine and oak, the ground covered in a spongy layer of fallen needles and leaves. Birds chirped here and there, but otherwise it was quiet. Too quiet, sometimes. I kept thinking I should hear running water soon, but all I could hear was the occasional rustle of branches and the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. Around midday, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, almost hidden by thick brush and leaning trees. The water was still and dark, reflecting the sky like glass. I dropped my pack and took a long drink, feeling the dryness in my throat from hiking in the sun. I decided to set up camp about 50 yards from the lake's edge. The spot was flat, sheltered by tall pines, with some fallen logs I could use for sitting and cooking. It took an hour to pitch the tent, arrange my gear, and start a small fire. I was tired but content. The solitude was peaceful. I'd spend the evening reading, cooking dinner, and just soaking in the quiet. By the time the sun was low, the forest around me had changed. Shadows stretched long and dark, folding into every corner of the woods. The sounds of daytime birds faded, replaced by the subtle calls of night creatures. Crickets and frogs began their chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a lone owl hooted. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated noodles and ate slowly by the fire. The warmth was comforting. I could see the flickering flames reflecting off the lake, and the stars began to pierce the twilight sky. I felt good. safe even. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. and zipped it closed, shutting out the night sounds. The fabric walls rustled gently with the breeze. I unrolled my sleeping bag, took a sip of water, and lay back to rest. But sleep was slow to come. The quiet was different here, thicker, heavier, like something pressing against the edges of the dark. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself it was just the wildness of the forest, the unfamiliar environment. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, barely audible at first, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. It wasn't the sound of an animal. No claw scratches or bird calls. It was deliberate, steady, like something pounding on wood or metal. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped. My heart hammered. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fallen branch hitting a rock, or the wind shaking a tree trunk. I forced my eyes shut and eventually drifted into restless sleep. Sometime later, I woke abruptly. My whole body was tense. The sound was back. Louder this time, thump, thump, thump. It was coming from just outside my tent, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I lay still, my mind racing. I could barely make out shapes beyond the tent's thin walls in the moonlight. The pounding stopped. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around my campsite, crunching leaves and twigs. Heavy boots. I wanted to scream, run, grab my flashlight, but I was frozen. The footsteps circled the tent and then stopped. I could feel the presence there, just beyond the thin nylon. I held my breath, my hands shaking. The silence stretched unbearably long. Then, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping close to the tent. Suddenly, the fire I'd left burning was stomped out. Pitch black swallowed the clearing. My heart threatened to burst from my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight inside the tent, struggling with the zipper, finally clicking it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, landing on the edge of the clearing. Nothing, just trees, and the lake shimmering faintly behind them. I scanned frantically. The footsteps had vanished. I sat awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound, movement, voices, anything. But only the normal night noises came. Frogs, insects, the rustling of leaves. By dawn, I was exhausted, jittery, and cold. The sun slowly climbed, filtering golden light through the trees. I decided to break camp early and head back. Packing up took longer than usual. I moved with hurried, nervous energy. My mind replayed the night's events over and over. Who had been out there? What did they want? Why hadn't they tried to talk or reveal themselves? I retraced my steps back to the car. The forest seemed brighter, less threatening in the daylight, but I still kept checking over my shoulder. When I reached the dirt road, I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, but no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no choice but to drive out myself. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I knew the forest wasn't haunted. No supernatural forces, just a very real threat. Someone had been watching me, circling my camp, knocking out my fire, and trying to scare me off. A few days later, after I'd recovered, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told me that area was known for illegal activity. Drug growers sometimes used those woods because they were remote and rarely patrolled. People trespassing, poachers, and others looking to stay hidden. I never went back. That night in the woods wasn't scary because of ghosts or monsters. It was the very real fear of being vulnerable and alone, and knowing someone else was out there, close enough to touch you, but choosing to keep silent. I never expected a simple trip to a remote cabin to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters or any of the usual things people expect from scary stories. It was just about being completely alone, trapped in a place that slowly became more threatening with every passing hour. And the worst part? It was all real. No fairy tales, no supernatural stuff. Just the kind of danger that comes from being isolated and vulnerable in the middle of nowhere. It all began on a late October afternoon. I decided to spend a weekend away from the city, away from noise, away from everything. The idea was simple. Rent a small cabin deep in the woods, relax, hike a little, read, and get some fresh air. I'd been working long hours for months and needed a break. Something quiet and out of reach of everything. I found a cabin advertised online. It was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, with a small lake a mile away. The pictures looked perfect. A cozy little place with a fireplace, a small porch, and nothing but trees around it. The listing said it had electricity and running water, but no cell service. That was part of the appeal. No distractions, no phone calls, just me and the woods. The drive out was calm at first. The road became narrower and rougher the farther I went, twisting between tall pines and maples, their leaves turning orange and red. I stopped once or twice just to breathe the crisp air and snap pictures. The sky was clear, the sun low but still bright. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I imagined but charming. A simple wooden structure, weathered but well cared for. The porch had a rocking chair, and a pile of firewood sat stacked by the side. I pulled my bags out of the car and took a moment to just look around. The silence was thick. No cars, no people, just the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and old wood. The furniture was sparse, a small table, 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink and a stove. I turned on the lights and noticed how the bulbs flickered a little but stayed steady. The heating was electric, and it hummed quietly in the background. Everything seemed to work. I unpacked quickly and set some firewood in the fireplace, even though it was still warm outside. It was more for the mood. Then I went outside to explore a little. The woods were thick and dark, but the sun was still high enough to see the path down to the lake. I walked slowly, enjoying the feeling of solitude. The lake was smaller than I thought, but the water was clear and still. The far side was lined with tall grass and reeds. I sat on a rock by the edge and took out a notebook, jotting down some thoughts about the trip, the city, and how good it felt to be somewhere quiet. The air was chilly but refreshing. As the sun began to dip lower, I headed back to the cabin. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, canned soup and some bread I'd brought. The fire in the fireplace crackled as I ate, the warmth soothing after the cool air outside. I stayed up reading until the light outside faded completely, and the woods grew pitch black beyond the windows. Then the silence started to change. It wasn't the quiet I had expected, not the peaceful silence of a calm forest. It was heavier, like the kind of silence that waits for something to happen. I noticed sounds, faint snaps of twigs, the rustling of leaves, something moving just beyond the edge of the porch light. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons maybe, but the sounds were closer than I expected. Sometimes it felt like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I peeked outside but only saw shadows moving between the trees. I locked the door and shut the curtains, trying to calm my nerves. The cabin felt small all of a sudden, the walls closing in on me. I kept the fire going, piling logs on it to keep the glow bright. Hours passed and I listened. The noises didn't stop. Sometimes they'd get louder, then fade away. A sharp crack like a branch breaking close by made me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and walked carefully outside to check, but all I found were some broken twigs and disturbed leaves. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell signal. The cabin's landline was old and disconnected, and I checked earlier to be sure. I was completely alone. The night dragged on, each noise making my heart race. I didn't sleep much, too alert to every sound. Then, just before dawn, I heard something unmistakable, footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy. Someone was there. I froze, clutching my flashlight, trying to steady my breathing. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see anyone clearly. But the footsteps were real, and whoever it was walking right outside the door. I wanted to yell or run, but my body was locked in place. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, but nothing else happened. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the forest. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to look for signs. There were footprints in the dirt, large boots, fresh. They circled the cabin, as if someone had been watching me all night. Panic hit me hard. I gathered my things quickly, planning to leave. But then I realized the car wasn't where I'd parked it. It was gone. The spot where I'd left the car was empty, just tire tracks fading into the dirt road. Someone had taken it. I was trapped. The nearest town was 2 hours away on foot through dense forest. I didn't have much water or food. I thought about staying in the cabin and waiting for someone to come, but the thought of staying there with whoever had been outside that night terrified me. I packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a pocket knife, a water bottle, and some snacks. Then I locked the cabin door behind me and stepped into the woods. Walking through the forest was harder than I expected. The trees were close together, and the underbrush was thick. Every sound made me jump: a bird calling, leaves crunching underfoot, the wind moving through the branches. Hours passed. I followed the dirt road as best as I could, hoping it would lead to help. I had no map, no compass, and no idea if I was going the right way. My legs grew tired, my mouth dry. At one point, I thought I heard voices far ahead, but when I ran toward the sound, there was nothing but silence again. The forest seemed endless. As the sun began to set, I realized I couldn't keep going in the dark. I found a small clearing and made a temporary shelter out of fallen branches and leaves. I built a small fire with the matches I had, the smoke rising into the cold air. That night, I didn't sleep much either. The sounds of the forest were all around me, but I felt safer out in the open than back in the cabin where someone had been watching. The next morning, I started walking again, hoping to reach the road or find someone. After several more hours, I finally heard the distant sound of a car engine. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting as loud as I could. A man in a pickup truck slowed down and stopped, surprised to see me. I explained quickly what had happened. He called the police, and a search party was sent to the cabin. When they found it, the front door was damaged, like someone had tried to force it open. My car was about a mile down the road, abandoned with the keys still in the ignition. The police said it looked like someone had been stalking the area, maybe watching for travelers like me. There were reports of car thefts and break-ins nearby, but nothing violent so far. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. The memory of those footsteps outside the door, the empty car spot, and the long walk through the forest stayed with me. What I learned from that trip was simple. The real terror isn't in ghosts or monsters. It's in the people who hide in the shadows, waiting for their chance. And when you're alone, far from help, that's the scariest thing of all. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I'm not the type who seeks out trouble or goes into the woods to find it. I'm just a regular guy who likes to get away from the noise sometimes. Last fall, I decided to spend a few days alone in a cabin I'd rented deep in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania. The kind of place with no internet, no cell service, just me and the silence. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from work and city life. The cabin itself was old but solid, built by hand probably decades ago. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a rickety front porch with creaky boards. It sat at the end of a rough dirt road that had faded away into the forest. You had to drive miles through nothing but tall pines and thick underbrush. The owner said the nearest neighbor was a mile away, maybe more. I packed what I needed: food for a few days, water, warm clothes, a flashlight, some matches, and a pocket knife. I didn't want to carry too much. The goal was to be self-sufficient and just enjoy the quiet. I arrived just before dusk and spent the first hour exploring the cabin and the small clearing around it. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I stacked some firewood next to the porch, planning to light a fire that night. The first night was calm. I built a fire in the stone hearth and sat near it, warming my hands and cooking some canned beans over the flames. Outside, the forest was pitch black except for the thin crescent moon high above. No wind, no animals calling. It was almost too quiet. Around midnight, I heard something. A soft scrape, like fingernails dragging over wood, coming from outside the cabin. I froze and listened hard. The sound stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, peering out into the dark. Nothing but shadows and trees. I convinced myself it was probably a branch rubbing against the cabin or maybe a deer brushing past. I closed the door and went back inside. I kept my knife nearby and double-checked the locks on the windows and door. Then I settled back near the fire and eventually fell asleep, though I woke several times thinking I heard footsteps just outside, soft and slow. I spent the next day walking the nearby trails, following a small creek that ran through the forest. The air was cold and smelled like damp leaves. I found some wild mushrooms growing near fallen logs, but didn't pick them because I wasn't sure if they were safe. The forest was quiet, but it felt different, like it was watching me. Back at the cabin, I checked my food supplies and started cutting more firewood. The cabin's porch boards creaked under my boots. When I looked out over the clearing, I noticed something odd. The ground near the edge of the woods had been disturbed. It looked like footprints, but they weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. The prints were large, too big for a deer or bear, and the shape was weird, like a human foot, but the toes seemed too long and thin. I felt a cold chill, but told myself it was probably just an old animal trail or something left by hunters. That night, the scrape sound returned. It was louder this time, like something dragging against the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The cabin's wooden walls seemed to creak and moan with the wind, but the wind had died down. Suddenly, the back door rattled. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, where the door had a simple wooden latch. It was closed tight, but the rattling was strong, like someone was trying to force it open. I grabbed my knife and pushed the door hard. It didn't budge. I backed away, listening closely. The noise stopped. I stood frozen for a minute, then checked all the windows. Every latch was still in place. No sign anyone had touched the doors. I sat down and waited, eyes fixed on the door, but nothing else happened that night. I decided to pack up early the next day and head home. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore, even though I hadn't seen anyone. I was careful to double-check my gear and keep my knife close. Before leaving, I went to inspect the disturbed ground again. The prints were still there, fresh and deeper than before, like someone had been walking just outside all night. I took pictures with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't have reception to send them. It felt important to have proof. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something on the porch. There was a small pile of stones stacked near the door. They weren't there when I arrived. The stones were smooth river rocks, different from the ones around the cabin. They were arranged carefully, almost like a marker. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever had been outside wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me, maybe waiting. The dirt road back to my car was longer than I remembered. The forest seemed thicker, darker. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone hiding in the trees. The sun was starting to dip low, and the shadows grew long. At one point, I heard branches snapping behind me. I stopped and spun around, flashlight raised, but only saw empty woods. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I started walking faster, trying not to run, telling myself it was just an animal. The sound kept coming, slow footsteps, broken twigs, moving closer. I broke into a run, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard about people disappearing in the woods. But this wasn't a story. It was real. After what felt like forever, I saw the dirt road open up and my car parked by the side. Relief washed over me like a wave. I unlocked the door and jumped in, locking it behind me. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, sweat on my brow despite the cold. Then I noticed something on the car's roof. A single smooth stone, like the ones from the porch. No footprints or tire tracks around it, just the rock. That was when I knew. Whoever had been outside wasn't just watching. They were close enough to reach the car. They had been following me. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I kept seeing that stone in my mind. I searched online for reports of people missing or strange activity near the cabin but found nothing. I showed the pictures of the footprints to a few local park rangers. One told me they'd heard rumors about someone living off the grid in the woods, but no one had proof. I never went back. This wasn't a story about ghosts or monsters. It was about a real person or people living hidden in the woods, watching, waiting. Someone who knew how to move quietly, how to leave signs without being caught. The footprints were too big and the arrangements of stones too deliberate to be anything else. What scared me most was how close they got without me noticing. How they could be right outside my door, watching me sleep, and I wouldn't know until it was almost too late. Looking back, I understand now what I should have done differently. I should have left right after the first night. I should have stayed in my car or called for help. But when you're alone in the woods, cut off from everything, it's easy to convince yourself it's nothing, just nature. The truth is, some dangers don't come from wild animals or storms. They come from people hiding in plain sight who know how to use the forest as their cover. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, a quiet place to breathe. Instead, it became a place I never want to return to, a place where I learned just how thin the line is between safety and danger, and how fast it can vanish. I still keep that stone on my desk now, a reminder that out there, in the quiet woods, someone is still watching. I never thought a simple weekend getaway would turn into something I'd replay in my head for years. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet break from the city, a place to unplug and recharge, but instead, it became the worst 3 days of my life. It was mid-October when I decided to rent the cabin. The leaves were changing colors, the air crisp but not cold yet. The place was out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods, exactly what I wanted. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just nature and silence. I was alone and I wanted it that way. The drive there took longer than I expected. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees whose branches curled overhead like a dark tunnel. By the time I reached the gravel driveway, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself looked older than the listing photos suggested. It was a small, wooden structure with faded paint peeling off the walls. A rusty old lantern hung by the door, and the windows were grimy, so I couldn't see inside very well. Still, I was determined. I dragged my bags up the steps and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and stale air. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The main room had a stone fireplace, a sagging couch, and a small kitchen area with a stove and sink. The floorboards creaked underfoot. It was rough, but it was home for the weekend. After unpacking, I set about lighting a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry enough, and the flames slowly licked the stone hearth, throwing warm orange light around the room. I made myself some instant coffee and settled on the couch with a blanket. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I figured it was just the usual wildlife. Deer, raccoons, maybe some squirrels. Nothing to worry about. But as the night deepened, something about those sounds changed. They became sharper, more deliberate, not random. It felt like the woods were watching me. I kept glancing out the windows, but the darkness swallowed everything. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the forest. The first night was restless. I woke several times, hearing something brush against the cabin walls. At one point, I heard heavy breathing outside, just beyond the window. I froze, holding my breath, but when I looked, there was nothing, just shadows. Morning brought some relief. The sun streamed through the windows, chasing away the darkness. I went outside to explore. The trees stretched endlessly, their trunks thick and rough under my fingers. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. As I wandered, I found old footprints in the mud, large, uneven prints, like someone had been trudging through the woods for hours. I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old, but they definitely weren't mine. I followed them for a while, but they vanished near a small creek. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I filled my water bottle, thinking about how isolated this place really was. Back at the cabin, I decided to build a stronger fire. I stacked wood carefully, making sure it would burn through the night. I also checked the windows and doors, making sure they were locked tight. The old cabin had a few flimsy locks, but it was better than nothing. That afternoon, I found an old journal in a drawer by the fireplace. The pages were yellowed and brittle, written in faded ink. It belonged to someone named Tom, who had stayed in the cabin years ago. His notes were mostly about the wildlife and the seasons, but as I read further, the entries grew darker. He wrote about strange noises at night, about feeling watched, and about finding things moved or missing when he woke up. One entry mentioned broken glass outside, though he never figured out where it came from. The last entry was just a few words. "Something is out here. It's not animals." I put the journal down, feeling a chill. Maybe I wasn't imagining things after all. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. The fire sputtered and threatened to die out, but I managed to keep it going. I wrapped myself tighter in the blanket and stared into the shadows beyond the window. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping on the cabin wall.
Top, top, top.
I didn't move at first, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The tapping came again, soft but persistent, like fingernails dragging across wood. I stood up, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen, and crept to the window. Outside, the forest was black. No moon, no stars, just darkness. I shined the flashlight around, but all I saw were tree trunks and leaves. No movement. The tapping stopped. I locked the window and backed away, trying to tell myself it was a branch knocked loose by the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, eager to get back to civilization. But as I pulled open the front door, I froze. There were footprints all around the cabin now. They circled the building, some pressed against the walls, others leading into the woods. They were too big to be animal tracks. Panic hit me like a wave. I grabbed my bag and ran to the car. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I sprinted down the driveway. Just as I was about to get in, I saw something hanging from a tree branch near the edge of the clearing. It was a single, cracked piece of glass, like the one Tom mentioned in his journal. I didn't stop to think. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark as I sped down the road. I didn't look back. I wasn't supposed to be there. The plan was simple. Drive out to the cabin, spend the weekend alone to clear my head, and then head back. Nothing more than a quiet break from the city noise and deadlines. But the silence I found wasn't the kind you want. It was the kind that makes you second-guess every sound, every shadow, every breath. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through thick stands of pine and fir trees. I'd driven that road more than once, but this time, the light was fading fast, and the sun was slipping behind the hills. The last few miles had been tough, potholes and loose gravel making the tires slip. I remember gripping the steering wheel tight, eyes locked on the road ahead, trying not to think about what would happen if the car broke down out here. The cabin was an old wooden structure, with weathered gray boards and a sagging porch. It looked like it had been built in the 50s or 60s, maybe earlier. The windows were dusty and clouded over, and the door creaked on its hinges when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and a faint sourness, like mold or old smoke. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. I had packed some essentials: food, water, a small camping stove, and a few tools I thought might come in handy. There was an old cast iron stove in the corner, cold and dark now. I set down my bag and started to unpack, lighting a lantern to chase the shadows away. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a low moan that seemed louder because of the quiet. I lit a small fire in the stove to warm the place up and sat down with a bottle of water, trying to settle my nerves. The first night was strange but mostly uneventful. I'd expected it to be peaceful, maybe a little lonely. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional snap of twigs or rustle of leaves. But that quiet wasn't comforting. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small creek nearby, and beyond that, dense woods that looked untouched for miles. The trees were tall and close together, their branches tangled so thickly that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I found some old trails, overgrown and barely visible, maybe used by hunters or hikers long ago. I wandered carefully, marking my path with stones so I could find my way back. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. A few small piles of stones arranged in patterns near the creek. Not natural formations, but clearly placed by someone. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone had been there before me. But the feeling that I was being watched started to grow. I kept turning my head, catching glimpses of movement just beyond my sight. A flicker of shadow, a rustle in the underbrush. Nothing clear, but enough to put me on edge. The night that followed was worse. The wind picked up, shaking the cabin's walls and howling through the trees. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, listening to the sounds outside. Every creak or groan of the cabin made me flinch. Then I heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps pacing outside the cabin. I didn't dare open the door, didn't want to see what was there. The footsteps stopped and started again, slow and measured, circling the cabin. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was dying, and I didn't know if anyone would come looking for me out here. I gripped my knife under the blanket, trying to stay calm. Morning never felt so good. When light finally crept through the curtains, I opened the door with trembling hands. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, footprints pressed into the dirt and leaves. They were fresh. Someone had been here, close enough to reach the cabin in the middle of the night. I scanned the trees but saw no one. I packed my things quickly, ready to leave. But then I noticed something on the porch, a crudely carved message scratched into the wood of the railing. It was just a series of letters and numbers, but they didn't make any sense to me. Something about the pattern felt deliberate, like a warning or a code. I took a picture with my phone, hoping it might make sense later. As I loaded my bag into the car, I heard a shout in the distance. Far enough away to be meaningless, but close enough to remind me I was not alone. The forest swallowed the sound quickly, but I didn't need any more reminders. The drive back was tense. Every few miles, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the road behind was empty. When I finally reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. Back in town, I showed the photo of the carving to a local shopkeeper. He frowned, saying he'd seen similar marks before near the border of the forest, a spot known for illegal activities. People disappearing, strange camps set up in the woods, but nothing the police talked about openly. I realized then the cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was a hideout, a place where someone had been watching, waiting. The footsteps, the carvings, the feeling of being hunted. They all made sense in a way that was worse than any ghost story. The forest didn't want visitors, and I'd been lucky to get out. I hadn't planned on spending that night in the cabin. It was supposed to be a quick weekend trip, a break from the city noise, a chance to clear my head, but everything went sideways. By the time it got dark, I was alone, miles away from anyone, and trapped in a place I barely knew. The cabin itself was an old, weathered building tucked into the woods near the edge of a national forest. I'd found it listed on a website for remote rentals, somewhere cheap and quiet. The pictures looked promising. A small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a porch with a cracked rocking chair, and windows that gave a glimpse into a simple, rustic interior. I thought it'd be perfect for a few days to myself. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. When I arrived just before dusk, the air was cold and smelled like pine and damp earth. The sky was clear, the sun dipping behind the dense trees. I parked my car in a small clearing, grabbed my backpack, and walked the short path to the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, revealing a room filled with old furniture and the faint smell of dust and wood smoke. There was a small kitchen area with a rusty stove, a table covered in faded scratches, and a threadbare rug covering the floor. I set my bag down and immediately noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses on your ears. No birds chirping, no wind rustling leaves, nothing. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I unpacked some food and water, lit the old stove to warm up the place, and sat down on the rickety wooden chair by the table. Outside, the sky turned a deep blue and stars began to appear. I thought about taking a walk around the property before nightfall, but something in the stillness made me hesitate. Instead, I stayed inside, lighting a few candles I found in a dusty cabinet. Hours passed and the cabin grew colder despite the stove. I wrapped myself in a worn blanket and tried to settle in, but the silence became suffocating. My mind started playing tricks on me. Every creak of the wood, every snap of a twig outside, felt amplified. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight stretched across the walls like dark fingers. Then, around midnight, the noises began. First, it was a low scratching sound coming from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen window. Slow, deliberate, like claws dragging across wood. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but the sound was too persistent, too focused. I got up cautiously and moved toward the window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing but the black outline of trees. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick branches. The scratching stopped suddenly. I exhaled slowly, telling myself to calm down. I turned back toward the living area, and that's when I noticed the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I hadn't even thought about the basement until that moment. The cabin had a small cellar under the floorboards, with a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness. The door had been closed when I arrived. I was sure of it. Curiosity and fear mixed inside me. I knew basements in old cabins could be dangerous, unstable floors, maybe even wild animals nesting. But I needed to check it out. Maybe that scratching had come from below. I found my flashlight and took a deep breath. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I slowly descended. The air grew colder and damp. I swept the beam across the low ceiling and the rough stone walls. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Just the echo of my footsteps and my breath. Halfway down the stairs, I caught a glimpse of something out of place. A pile of old, broken tools stacked in the corner, and behind them, a faint trail of muddy footprints leading toward a door at the far end. The door was closed, but the footprints continued beneath it. My heart raced. Who else could be here? I pushed the door open carefully. It led to a tiny, cramped storage room filled with old crates and rusty cans. I checked every corner. Nothing. No signs of recent visitors except those muddy footprints. I went back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I sat down again, trying to shake the unease. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest town. My phone had no signal, and the nearest road was at least an hour away. I had no way to call for help if something went wrong. The scratching returned, but this time it was different. It was outside, circling the cabin. Slow, measured, almost like something was pacing. I looked out the window again. The forest was still, but I could see a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight, watching me from just beyond the treeline. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen and quietly moved to the back door. I locked it and blocked it with a chair. The windows were all shut tight, but the presence outside was unmistakable. I sat down with my back against the wall, the pan resting on my lap, my ears straining for the smallest sound. The eyes never left. Hours passed like that. Every time I thought I could relax, the scratching and pacing resumed. The animal was too big for a raccoon or fox. It was something else. By dawn, the noises stopped. The forest came back to life with the sounds of birds and wind. I looked out carefully. No sign of the creature, just broken branches and disturbed dirt around the perimeter. The sun rose, but I still felt trapped in a heavy fog of fear. Couldn't wait to get out. I packed up quickly and locked the cabin behind me. As I walked back toward my car, I found more signs. Deep claw marks gouged into the wooden siding, large footprints in the soft ground around the clearing. That's when I realized what had been stalking me all night. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a bear. A large, hungry bear, likely attracted by the smell of food inside the cabin. If I'd been careless or unprepared, it could have been a deadly encounter. I drove away without looking back, heart still pounding. That night in the cabin wasn't just scary because of the silence or the dark. It was scary because I was completely vulnerable. No cell signal, no backup, just me and a wild animal testing the limits of its territory. From then on, I learned to respect how wild and unpredictable nature could be. The cabin looked harmless enough in pictures, but out there, alone, it was anything but safe. It was early October when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. The plan was simple. Get away from the city noise, spend a week alone with nothing but the quiet of the forest, some books, and my own thoughts. I'd been burned out from work, the constant buzz of emails and meetings, and just needed to clear my head. The cabin was old but sturdy, built decades ago by a family who'd since moved on. It was the kind of place you'd find on one of those tourist maps, labeled as a rustic retreat. But it wasn't fancy in any way. A small, one-room wooden shack with a stone fireplace, a creaky bed, and a tiny kitchen area. No internet, no cell service. Perfect for what I wanted. I drove up through winding dirt roads, leaves starting to turn gold and red, with that sharp autumn chill already in the air. When I finally parked and stepped out, the silence was immediate. No cars, no planes, just the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, fresh and cold. Inside the cabin, I unpacked slowly. The place was dusty, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows had a faint film of grime. There was an old wood stove, a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly beside it. I figured that would be my main heat source, as the place didn't have any electric or gas heating. The first night, I made a fire in the stove, feeling the warm glow spread through the small room. Outside, the woods pressed close around the cabin, black and still. I sat by the fire, reading a book and sipping on a flask of whiskey I'd brought. The wind whispered through the trees, sometimes making branches tap against the window. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That was when I first noticed something odd. A sudden, sharp snapping sound, like a branch breaking, came from the woods about 50 feet from the cabin. It was loud in the stillness. I paused, listening, but then the silence returned. No other sounds followed. I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving through the underbrush. Nothing to worry about. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a narrow dirt trail leading into the woods, barely visible beneath fallen leaves and pine needles. I followed it a short way, enjoying the crisp air and the colors of the trees. The trail curved and wound, but after maybe 20 minutes I turned back, not wanting to get lost. That evening, as the sun was setting, I sat outside the cabin watching the sky fade. Suddenly, I heard it again, the sound of snapping twigs, this time closer. I looked around but saw nothing. The forest was dense here, thick with fir and maple trees, casting long shadows even as the last light faded. I chalked it up again to animals and went inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I double-checked the windows and locked the simple latch. The cabin didn't have real locks like a city house, just old wooden latches, but it was better than nothing. I sat back by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods outside the window seemed to press closer, darker. The wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. My skin prickled. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunching on the dry leaves just beyond the porch. I froze. The cabin was small, and the door was just a few feet from the bed. I didn't want to move, scared to look out the window, but the sounds kept coming. Step, step, step just outside. I reached out quietly and grabbed the small hunting knife I kept in my backpack, the only weapon I had brought. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavier this time. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning light didn't bring much relief. The forest looked the same, peaceful from the outside, but inside I felt the tension hanging thick in the air. I checked the perimeter of the cabin during daylight, looking for any sign someone might have been near. Footprints, disturbed leaves, anything. I found nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For the next few days, I kept busy, collecting firewood, hiking the trail a bit further, reading. But each night, the footsteps returned. Sometimes more than one set, sometimes around the cabin, sometimes just beyond the trees. Always silent except for the crunching leaves. One night, I heard something worse. A low, steady thud on the side wall of the cabin, like someone pounding a fist against the wooden siding. I didn't dare look out. The pounding lasted maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I sat frozen by the fire, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn. I thought about leaving. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell signal, and I didn't even know where exactly I was on the map. I had told no one I was coming here. No one knew where the cabin was. The nearest town was miles away. I was completely alone. Still, I was stubborn. I told myself to tough it out, that whoever was out there couldn't hurt me if I stayed inside. On the fourth night, the footsteps started again, but this time I heard voices too. Low murmurs, unintelligible, coming from just outside the woods. I pressed my ear to the window, trying to catch a word, but nothing clear came through. I remembered that old hunting knife and a small baseball bat I had found in the cabin's corner. I grabbed both, sat by the door, and waited. The voices faded, but the footsteps continued, circling the cabin. Then, I noticed something new. Scratches on the door. Deep, ragged marks like someone had tried to claw or force their way in. The wood was splintered in places. My stomach dropped. I stayed up all night that night, barely breathing, listening to every sound. At dawn, I went outside to examine the damage. The scratches were fresh. I couldn't see any footprints in the dirt. Too many fallen leaves covered the ground, but the marks on the door were undeniable. I decided I needed to get out of there, but the dirt road was blocked by a fallen tree, probably from a recent storm. No way I could get my car through, and the trail I'd walked earlier was too narrow and wild to risk hiking out in the dark. So I spent the next day clearing the road with an axe I found inside the cabin. It was slow, exhausting work, but I managed to cut enough branches and debris to drive my car through. That night, I was restless. I barely slept, the sounds outside growing louder and more frequent. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps running through the underbrush. It was close, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. I peeked through the curtains, and for a moment, I saw a shadow moving between the trees. Not a deer, not an animal. A man. He was hunched, wearing a dark jacket and hat, moving fast. I slammed the curtain shut and stepped back. I realized I was being stalked. I locked every latch I could find, shoved furniture against the door, and sat in the corner with the knife and bat, waiting for dawn. I kept trying to convince myself it was some hunter or local who was lost or drunk, but the scratches on the door and the footsteps said otherwise. When first light came, I packed my things quickly and headed out to my car. The road was clear enough now, and I didn't look back. Driving down the dirt road, the forest on either side looked calm and quiet, but I felt eyes on me, like something was watching from the trees. I made it to the highway and stopped at the first gas station I could find. I told the clerk about what happened, but she just shrugged, said people sometimes camp too far out and freak themselves out. I called the local ranger station later that day and reported the stalking, but they said there was no one reported missing or suspicious in the area. They said maybe it was just wildlife or my imagination, but it wasn't. I've never been back to that cabin, and I never will. The truth is, someone had been living in those woods, close to the cabin. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who knew exactly where I was, watching me every night. The scratches on the door weren't made by animals. The footsteps weren't just deer or bears. I never saw the man clearly enough to identify him, but I'm convinced it was a hunter or a local who felt threatened by an outsider like me. Looking back, I realized how foolish I was to go alone, without telling anyone my exact location or plan. The woods may look peaceful, but there are people out there who don't want strangers in their territory. The fear I felt wasn't from ghosts or monsters, but from a real human danger. Now, when I think of that trip, it's not the beauty of the forest or the quiet that comes to mind. It's the sound of footsteps in the dark, the scratches on the door, and the feeling of being hunted. And sometimes, late at night, I still imagine those footsteps outside my own window. I didn't want to go alone, not because I was scared, but because the idea of spending a weekend isolated in a cabin miles away from the nearest town felt unnecessary. But everyone else had their plans, and I was left with the choice of canceling or going by myself. I chose to go. I wanted the quiet, the break from city noise and endless calls and screens. I wanted to breathe, and I figured the cabin was the perfect spot. The drive was longer than I expected. I left early morning, the sky a dull gray and the air heavy with a spring chill. The road wound deeper and deeper into the woods, and the trees closed in like a tunnel, the branches weaving tight overhead. I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. The cabin was on a dirt road that branched off from the main highway, so narrow that two cars couldn't pass without one pulling over. Gravel crunched under my tires, the only sound besides my car's engine and the occasional bird call. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. A small, rough-hewn wooden building with a stone chimney. It sat on a slight hill, surrounded by thick forest. The trees were tall and dense, mostly pines and oaks. The ground was uneven and scattered with fallen branches and dry leaves. A thin layer of moss covered the rocks near the cabin's foundation. The front porch creaked slightly in the wind, its wood weathered but sturdy. I unloaded my bag, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The furniture was simple, a small table, 2 chairs, a couch, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was no electricity except for a few battery-powered lanterns and a propane lamp. The windows had no curtains, just glass panes that looked out at the darkening woods. I unpacked and stacked firewood next to the stove. The sky was still light but fading fast. I started the fire, the crackling flames throwing shadows on the walls. The only sound now was the steady hiss and pop of burning wood. I settled in with a book, but the words blurred as my mind wandered. The silence pressed down on me. It was so quiet that every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes and making the trees sway. That night, I slept with one ear open. The forest sounds were different here, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant call of an owl. But around 2 a.m., something else broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, soft thumps, like footsteps outside the cabin, circling around. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin door was locked tight, and the windows were shut, but the sound persisted. The footsteps weren't heavy, and they moved slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my breath, and inched toward the window. The beam of light scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing except the thick trees and shadows. The sounds stopped. My chest tightened. Was it an animal? Person? Couldn't tell. I debated going outside to check, but every instinct screamed not to. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes glued to the window, waiting, listening. Morning came slowly, gray and cold. I debated leaving but decided to stay one more day. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the idea of someone walking around my cabin at night unsettled me deeply. During the day, the woods looked calm and welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft patterns on the ground. I went for a short walk, taking in the fresh air, trying to shake the uneasy feeling from the night. The cabin felt safer in daylight. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, cleaned up, and settled back with my book. But as evening crept in, the nervous energy returned. That second night, the sounds outside came earlier. Around 10 p.m., I heard the same slow thumps, circling again. But this time, there was something different. A faint scraping sound, like something being dragged. My pulse jumped. I sat frozen, clutching the flashlight. The air suddenly felt colder, and the silence thickened between each noise. After what felt like an hour, the footsteps stopped. I kept the fire going all night, but sleep was impossible. On the third day, I decided to investigate carefully. I walked the perimeter of the cabin in daylight, looking for any signs of who or what could have been making the noises. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I found footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were human, size 10 boots, deep tread marks. They circled the cabin. There was no pattern to the path, just aimless wandering. Near the back porch, I saw drag marks in the dirt. Something heavy pulled roughly along the ground. My stomach dropped. I took pictures with my phone and decided to pack up in the morning. I felt watched, like someone was waiting, hiding in the woods. That night was worse. The footsteps started almost immediately after dark, louder, closer. The scraping sound came again, accompanied by low, muffled thuds, like someone knocking something heavy against the ground. I kept the lights off, hoping to stay unnoticed. But my nerves were raw. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch that cracked felt like a warning. Around midnight, the noise stopped suddenly. Then I heard something else. A sharp metallic click by the door. I froze. The lock was secure. Whoever was out there had tried to force it. I grabbed my phone and the small hunting knife I'd brought, ready to defend myself if needed. My mind raced through what to do next. I could call the police, but there was no signal here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I was alone. The night passed in a tense blur. No more sounds after the lock attempt, but I knew they hadn't left. I barely slept, waiting for dawn. When the first light touched the sky, I started loading my things into the car as fast as I could without making noise. Before leaving, I walked to the edge of the trees, trying to see if there was anyone there. Nothing but the usual birds and squirrels. But I found a small pile of branches and leaves disturbed, like someone had been hiding just out of sight. I drove away with my heart still racing. The woods looked peaceful in daylight, but I knew better now. Something had been out there, watching, waiting. The thought that someone had been so close, circling me all night, sending those sounds to scare me, stayed with me long after the cabin disappeared behind me. I never went back. I found the cabin by accident. It wasn't on any map I checked before I left the city, and I hadn't planned on finding it at all. I was on a solo trip, just me, my backpack, and a little tent I'd carried for camping. I wanted to get away from everything for a few days, no distractions, no noise but the wind and the trees. I figured I'd hike for a while, sleep under the stars, and maybe find a quiet spot near a stream to rest. That morning, I had woken up early in the woods, the sun just beginning to push through the pine trees. I packed up my things slowly, enjoying the quiet. My legs were sore from the previous day's hike, but it was a good kind of tired. I was somewhere in the middle of a forested area in the mountains. I had the general idea from a map on my phone before it died from lack of signal. I thought I'd head downhill toward a river I had seen marked, but then the trail split, and I got turned around. I walked without really thinking, just following what looked like a faint dirt path. The forest was thick, tall pines mostly, with some birches scattered around. The ground was soft with needles and damp leaves. It smelled like rain, fresh and earthy. I was moving slower now, watching my steps carefully, because the trail was getting narrower, almost disappearing in spots. After about an hour, I saw the roof. It was rusty and brown, poking out between the trees. At first, I thought it was just an old hunting blind or some kind of abandoned shed. But as I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. A small, simple wooden cabin. It looked old, but not falling apart. The walls were made of logs, and the windows were dusty but still intact. There was a little porch with a sagging roof over it, and a wood pile stacked neatly on one side. No smoke coming from a chimney, no sign of recent activity. Just quiet. I was curious. I wasn't the type to explore abandoned places, but I was tired and the idea of resting inside appealed to me. The last few days on the trail had been rough, and I hadn't had a proper meal or real shelter in a while. I walked up the porch steps carefully, the wood creaking under my boots. The door was locked, or at least it didn't open when I tried it. No key, obviously. I looked around the cabin, hoping to find another way inside. The windows were too high to reach without a ladder, and they were covered in grime. I circled the cabin, checking the back and sides. No other door, No basement hatch, no sign of people. It felt empty. I was about to give up and keep moving when I noticed the side window was slightly open. Just a crack, maybe a few inches. Someone must have been here recently. Maybe they forgot to close it all the way. I slid my backpack off and climbed onto the porch railing, then carefully squeezed through the gap, pulling myself inside. The air inside smelled musty and cold, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time. I stood up and looked around. It was small, just one room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. There was a small wood stove in one corner, cold and rusty, and a table pushed against the wall with a couple of wooden chairs. A rickety bunk bed was in the far corner, the mattress stained and old. Dust covered everything, but it looked solid enough. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath. At least I had shelter for the night. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the trees groan. I decided to start a fire in the stove to warm up. I found some dry kindling near the woodpile and used my lighter to get it going. The fire caught slowly, smoke curling up the chimney. The cabin was dimly lit by the fire and a small lantern on the table, with some old candles nearby. I sat down and pulled out my water bottle, sipping carefully. I was hungry but knew I didn't have much food left. I tried to calm my mind, enjoying the stillness. I thought maybe I could stay here overnight and then hike out tomorrow morning. But as the evening went on, the cabin began to feel off. Not haunted or anything like that, just wrong in a way I couldn't shake. The walls seemed too close, the shadows too deep. The wooden floorboards creaked sometimes, even though there was no wind inside. At first, I told myself it was just the old cabin settling. I tried to read a little, but the silence was heavy, and every little noise sounded loud. I got up to check the windows again, making sure they were closed tight now. That's when I noticed the faint marks on the floor near the door. Scuffs, like something had dragged across the wood recently. The dust wasn't completely undisturbed. I didn't see footprints, but something had been here not too long ago. That made me uneasy. I decided to explore a little more before settling down. On the wall opposite the stove was a small trapdoor. It was hidden under a ragged rug, and at first I thought it was just part of the floor. I pulled it up carefully and saw a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. No light, no windows, just the smell of damp earth and old wood. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and started down the stairs. The air was cold and thick, and my footsteps echoed in the narrow space. At the bottom, I found a small basement room. It was packed with old supplies, canned food, rusted tools, broken furniture, and something else. In the corner was a stack of plastic containers filled with papers and photographs. I pulled one out with my gloved hand and wiped the dust off. It was a photo of a man and a woman standing in front of the cabin, smiling. I recognized the man immediately from the look of him. It was someone from the nearby town, a guy who had gone missing last year. I remembered reading about him in the news. He had disappeared without a trace, and the police never found out what happened. My heart started to race. What was this? Was this cabin connected to that missing man? And what about the woman in the photo? No name, no other clues. I kept digging through the containers, pulling out more papers, notes, maps, and even a few letters. They were old and faded, but I could make out bits and pieces. It sounded like someone had been living here in secret, hiding from people, maybe even from the law. The letters talked about paranoia, about watching over the forest, about not trusting anyone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was this a hideout? Was someone still living here? I thought about the open window, the marks on the floor. Maybe someone was still around, watching, waiting. I hurried back upstairs, shutting the trapdoor behind me. The fire was almost out, but I rekindled it, the flickering flames casting long shadows. I double-checked the door and windows, making sure they were secure. Then I sat down with my back against the wall, my flashlight and my pack close. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, howling through the trees. The branches scraped against the cabin walls like fingernails. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside, just beyond the window. Sometimes the creaks and groans of the cabin seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. I didn't sleep much that night. At one point, I woke to a noise right outside the door. a soft scraping, like someone dragging something heavy over the ground. I held my breath and stayed very still. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and the forest was silent again. Morning finally came with gray light filtering through the windows. I packed my things quickly, feeling a deep unease. I wasn't going to stay here any longer. I opened the door slowly and looked around. The forest was quiet, peaceful in the daylight. I walked back the way I had come, but now I kept my eyes open for anything unusual. As I moved through the trees, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Big, heavy prints not far from the cabin. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were human. I kept moving faster now. After a while, I reached a small dirt road that led toward a ranger station I knew was a few miles down. I was safe now, at least in daylight. I told the rangers about the cabin and the things I found. The missing man's photo, the basement, the footprints. They told me the cabin had been a mystery for years, a place people avoided. Some said it belonged to a local who went off the grid, but no one had seen anyone in a long time. The missing man's case had never been solved. A few weeks later, I read in the news that the police had found a hidden room in the cabin's basement. Inside, they discovered evidence that linked the cabin to an illegal operation, drugs, stolen goods, and a makeshift prison cell. The missing man had been held captive there. The authorities arrested a suspect living nearby who had used the cabin as a secret hideout. The whole thing shook me. I had stumbled on something dangerous, something real, not ghosts or stories, but a place where terrible things had happened. I still think about that night in the cabin sometimes. How the silence felt thick, how the forest watched me. I don't regret going there, but I'm glad I didn't stay too long. Some places hide dark secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone at a small cabin deep in the woods. No phone signal, no internet, just me and the silence of the forest. I'd planned it all carefully, packed enough food, water, and gear to be self-sufficient. The cabin was off a dirt road in the mountains, surrounded by dense trees, far from any neighbors or roads. I needed the time away from the noise of city life, away from people. The drive up was long but peaceful. As I left the highway behind, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the forest grew thicker around the narrow road. I noticed how the tall pines crowded the edges of the road, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. By the time I reached the little clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon. The sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The cabin was small but solid, rough logs, a pitched roof, a stone chimney. There was a porch with a couple of chairs that looked weathered but sturdy. I parked the car and unloaded my bags, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The door opened with a creak that echoed in the quiet. Inside, the cabin was bare but clean. A small wood stove sat in the corner, and there were a few shelves with old books and some basic cooking supplies. The windows were dirty, but the glass was intact. I set my things down and lit a fire in the stove. The flames crackled, throwing warm light on the rough wooden walls. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove, the smell of cooking food filling the tiny room. Outside, the forest was already darkening. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my tired bones. That night, I slept with the window cracked open a little. The air was cool and fresh. I woke once or twice to the sounds of the forest. Branches scraping, small animals moving in the underbrush. Felt peaceful. The next day, I spent hours walking the trails nearby. The forest was beautiful, dense, wild, and ancient. I noted how the trees grew close together, their roots twisting over rocks and soil. The moss was thick and soft underfoot. I climbed a ridge and looked out over a valley filled with trees stretching to the horizon. The quiet was total except for the wind in the leaves and my own breathing. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart jumped. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. I checked the locks again, feeling my pulse quicken. Nothing inside looked disturbed. The few items I had brought were where I left them. I thought maybe the wind had blown it open, but the door was heavy, and the latch was strong. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to check around the perimeter. Walking the edge of the clearing, I looked for footprints or signs of someone else. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and I could see marks. Footprints, but they weren't mine. They were fresh, heading toward the cabin from the forest and then away again. They weren't big, maybe a medium-sized person, and definitely recent. I checked the car, it was untouched. No signs of forced entry anywhere. I considered calling someone but knew there was no cell signal here. I was alone. That night, I slept with the door locked and the windows shut tight. I piled some firewood near the door and kept a knife on the table beside me. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The forest noises were louder now. More animal sounds, branches cracking closer than before. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside the cabin. Something heavy moving near the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded. I held my breath, listening carefully. The sound stopped. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, like someone or something was moving just beyond the treeline. I stayed still, not daring to move or make a sound. After a long time, the noises faded, and the forest returned to silence. The next morning, I found more signs that I wasn't alone. On the porch, near my boots, there was a small pile of sticks arranged strangely, almost like a marker. It wasn't there the day before. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't understand what it meant. I felt watched even in the bright daylight. I checked my gear carefully, making sure everything was in place. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was miles away on a rough road, and I didn't want to drive back in the dark. Over the next couple of days, the tension grew. Every time I stepped outside, I noticed fresh footprints around the clearing. Sometimes they were close to the cabin. Other times, they led into the woods. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could be hunters or hikers passing by, but the idea didn't sit right. No one had told me the cabin was near a trail. At night, the sounds came closer. Branches snapping, footsteps crunching on dry leaves, low noises that I couldn't identify. The wind shifted, carrying strange smells. Smoke, wood smoke, but no fire burning near. One evening, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing just beyond the treeline. It vanished as quickly as I saw it. I was frozen in place, heart racing. I didn't sleep much after that. By the fourth day, I was running low on food and water. The well at the cabin was dry, and the creek nearby was a long walk. I decided I had to leave the next morning. That night, I double-checked the locks, piled furniture against the door, and placed my knife where I could reach it. I set the stove to burn bright to keep the cabin warm and bright inside. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a loud banging on the door. It shook the walls. I grabbed the knife and crept to the window, peering through the glass. Outside was darkness and trees. Nothing was there. I listened, heart hammering. The banging started again, rhythmic, heavy. Someone or something was trying to break in. I grabbed my backpack with the essentials, shoved it on, and moved to the back door. It was locked too. The banging stopped suddenly. I waited in silence, then moved to the back window. I pulled the curtains aside and saw footprints leading from the front door into the woods. The tracks were bigger now, deeper, like someone was stomping hard. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed what I could grab quickly, grabbed my knife and a flashlight, and slipped out the back door into the cold night. The woods were thick and black, but I moved fast, trying to keep my bearings by the moonlight. I followed the dirt road back the way I came. Branches scratched my arms and face. Roots tripped me several times. After nearly an hour, I reached the car. The engine started with a growl, and I drove away without looking back. The next day, when I reported the strange occurrences to the ranger station, they told me the area was known for trespassers and illegal hunters who sometimes camped illegally. No one had reported me missing because the cabin was private, but they took my story seriously. They warned me to avoid going alone again. Looking back, I understood it was never about ghosts or myths. It was about real people, strangers who used the woods for their own purposes, and I had stumbled into their space. The fear was real because the threat was real. The woods are not always safe, and sometimes the scariest thing is knowing that you're just a visitor, and others don't want you there. I didn't plan much before I left. Just packed some clothes, food, and my camera. I wanted to get away for a few days, somewhere quiet, somewhere with no distractions. The kind of place where you could hear the wind, the birds, and the trees moving. I found a small cabin for rent online. It was pretty basic, no electricity, no internet, no cell signal. Just the cabin, the forest, and a small lake nearby. Exactly what I wanted. The drive was longer than I thought. The last stretch was a rough dirt road winding through dense woods. The sun was already dipping low when I finally reached the cabin. It was a small wooden building, old but sturdy, with peeling paint and a rusty metal roof. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a stone chimney stuck out from one side. The air smelled sharp and clean, with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was dark but not unpleasant. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a wood stove in one corner, a small kitchen area with a sink and a few shelves, and a single room with a simple bed covered in an old quilt. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the door. The windows were dusty, but through them, I could see the tops of the trees, the fading light, and a glimpse of the lake beyond. I unpacked slowly, trying to get used to the quiet. No hum of electricity, no distant sounds of cars or people, just the forest. That first night, I made a fire in the stove. The warmth felt good, and the flickering flames cast moving shadows on the wooden walls. I ate some canned soup, then sat by the fire, reading a book. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and rustled, branches scraping against the cabin roof. It was a strange noise, like something scraping on wood or metal. But I told myself it was just the wind. I went to bed early. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean but thin. I could hear the wind even inside, and sometimes the creak of the cabin settling. I thought about the stories I'd read about people getting lost or hurt in the woods, but I was careful, experienced. I had a map, a compass, a flashlight. Morning came slowly. The light filtered in through the dirty windows, casting dull rays across the floor. Outside, the forest was bright and green, alive with the sound of birds and insects. I made coffee on the stove and ate some dry bread and jam. I decided to explore around the cabin, to stretch my legs and get a feel for the place. The lake wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk down a narrow path. The trail was overgrown in places, and the ground was soft and muddy from recent rain. When I reached the lake, I was surprised at how still it was. The surface was smooth like glass, reflecting the gray sky and tall trees. There were no boats, no docks, no signs of other people. Just me and the quiet. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out my camera. I took pictures of the water, the trees, the sky. The light was soft and even perfect for photos. I stayed by the lake for a while, watching a family of ducks swim quietly near the shore. Then I walked back toward the cabin, noticing the small sounds of the forest. A squirrel chattering, leaves rustling, a woodpecker tapping on a distant tree. When I got back, I decided to clear some space around the cabin. The brush was thick, and branches hung low near the windows. I used a small hatchet I'd brought to cut some of the smaller branches and clear the area near the front door. It was physical work, but it made me feel more settled, more at home. That night, I made a bigger fire. The cold was sharper than I expected, and the wind seemed to pick up again. I sat close to the stove, warming my hands, feeling the glow on my face. Around 10 p.m., I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but it was different. A soft scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the dirt or gravel. I stood up and walked to the window. The glass was dusty and fogged, but I peered out anyway. The moon was low, and the shadows were deep. I didn't see anything moving. The sound came again, quieter this time, but definitely there. It wasn't close to the cabin, but it was definitely outside. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat back by the fire. My heart was pounding more than usual. I kept my knife close on the table and stayed alert. The noise didn't come back that night, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined footsteps or scraping sounds just outside. In the morning, I found tracks in the dirt near the cabin. They were fresh and big, too big for any deer I knew. The prints looked like heavy boots with thick soles and deep treads. I felt a chill. I hadn't expected anyone else to be around here. The nearest road was miles away, and the place was supposed to be private. I checked my supplies and my phone again. No signal. I was truly alone. I decided to hike down the dirt road to the main highway later that day to see if I could get a signal or find help if I needed it. The hike was long and slow. The forest was dense, the trail narrow and sometimes slippery. I moved carefully, watching for signs of animals or people. At one point, I saw a small campsite that looked abandoned. A few burnt logs, an empty can, some trash left behind. It didn't look recent, but it wasn't old either. I took a photo and kept moving. When I finally reached the highway, I found a small clearing with a weak phone signal. I sent a quick message to a friend, just letting them know where I was and that everything was okay. That night, after I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The firewood pile was disturbed. Some logs were scattered on the ground, broken or moved. I was certain I'd stacked them neatly that morning. I looked around the cabin carefully. There were no footprints near the woodpile in the fresh dirt, but something felt off. Then I noticed the door. It was unlocked. I'm positive I locked it before I left that morning. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon had pushed the logs around. I found a heavy stick outside and brought it inside for protection. I sat by the fire, knife and stick in hand, eyes scanning the dark. I didn't hear anything else that night. No scraping sounds, no footsteps. I woke early, feeling tired and uneasy. The cabin felt smaller somehow, more closed in. I packed a bag with some essentials and decided I would leave by noon, even if that meant a long hike down the dirt road. Before I left, I took one last look around the cabin. I checked all the windows and doors, locked everything carefully. Then I walked outside to grab some water from the lake. As I approached the small path, I noticed something I hadn't before. Deep scratches on the wooden door frame of the cabin. They looked recent, like someone or something had clawed at the wood. My heart raced. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe it was a bear or a wild animal. Bears can be strong and curious. Still, the thought of someone being so close to the cabin, someone who had been moving logs and unlocking doors without me knowing, made me nervous. I started walking down the dirt road, eager to get back to civilization. The woods were quiet again, but my senses were sharper than ever. Every sound made me turn my head. Every shadow seemed to move. After about an hour, I heard a noise behind me, a low snapping of twigs and footsteps. I stopped and turned quickly. Nothing. I kept walking faster, my breath coming out in short bursts. The noise came again, louder and closer. Someone was following me. I broke into a run, heart pounding, legs burning. I didn't look back until I reached the highway, where cars passed by and people were around. I called the local sheriff's office and told them about the cabin, the tracks, and the noises. They came the next day and searched the area. They found evidence that someone had been living near the cabin, an illegal camper or a homeless person hiding in the woods. The scratches were from a bear, but the person had used that to scare off anyone who might come near. The footsteps, the moving logs, the unlocked door, all signs that someone was watching the cabin. They told me not to go back there alone, that these woods were known for trespassers who could be dangerous. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just people. People you don't see but who see you. People who might be living on the edge, hiding, watching, waiting. That cabin wasn't just a quiet getaway. It was a place where someone else had already made a home. A place where I wasn't alone, even if I thought I was. I had been looking forward to that weekend in the cabin for weeks. It was supposed to be a break from the constant noise of the city, a chance to disconnect and spend some quiet time alone with nothing but the woods and the cold winter air. The cabin was tucked away in a dense forest in northern Vermont, about an hour off the main road by a bumpy dirt path. I'd rented it from a small local owner through an online site, and the pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines and firs, with a small frozen lake visible through the trees. I arrived late Friday afternoon, after driving hours through narrow winding roads lined with snow-dusted trees. The sun was already low behind the branches when I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was just as the pictures showed: rough-hewn logs, a small porch with a woodpile stacked to one side, and the faint smell of pine and wood smoke in the cold air. I pulled my car up next to the cabin and stepped out into the silence. The snow was packed hard underfoot, and a thin layer of ice crackled beneath my boots as I walked to the front door. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The floors were wooden planks, worn but clean, and the furniture was simple: an old wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small sofa near the stone fireplace. There was a wood stove and a stack of logs next to it. I switched on the small propane heater to take the chill off the air and started unpacking my things. I had brought food, firewood, a lantern, and extra blankets. I wanted to be prepared because I knew that once the sun went down, the temperature would drop fast. As I settled in, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just quiet, but an almost suffocating silence. No distant traffic, no planes overhead, no voices or dogs barking. Just the occasional creak of the old cabin and the whisper of wind through the trees. I liked that kind of silence in small doses, but as night came on, it began to feel heavier. I built a fire in the stove and sat close to the warm glow, drinking some coffee from my thermos. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rattling the windows and causing the trees to sway. The snow, which had been still when I arrived, now began to fall lightly again, a thin white veil settling over everything. As the night deepened, I noticed how the shadows seemed to move, not with life, but with the flicker of the firelight. The cabin was small, and the darkness pressed close around me, as if trying to squeeze into the room through every crack and corner. I checked my phone. No signal. Not that I expected one, but it was a reminder of how isolated I was here. Sleep was slow to come. The sounds outside, the creaks and groans of the old trees, the occasional thump of something hitting the roof or the side of the cabin, kept my senses alert. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was tense. It was like my mind was trying to fill the silence with stories and warnings that didn't exist. At some point in the early morning hours, I was jolted awake by a noise, a sharp scrape, like nails on wood, coming from just outside the cabin. I lay still, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The wind had died down, and the usual forest sounds seemed muted. Then the scraping noise came again, slower this time, almost deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it an animal? A branch falling? Someone outside? I stayed frozen under the covers, clutching my flashlight. The scrape came a third time, then silence. I didn't dare move, too nervous to look out the window. After what felt like an hour, I drifted back to a restless sleep. Morning came slowly. The weak, pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. I got up and put on extra layers. The fire was almost out, and the cabin felt colder than it had the night before. I checked outside cautiously. The snow was undisturbed except for a few small animal tracks. No sign of any people or larger animals. I stepped down from the porch and looked around the clearing. That scraping noise had come from the side of the cabin. I walked over and inspected the wall. There was a faint scratch mark on the wood, fresh enough to stand out against the weathered logs. The mark was long, maybe a foot or more, and rough, like something sharp had been dragged along the siding. My stomach tightened. I thought about the possibilities, a bear clawing at the wood? But the scratch didn't look like it was from an animal's claw. It was more like a tool or a sharp piece of metal scraping the wood deliberately. I decided to stay on edge for the rest of the day, even though the sun shone bright and the wind was calm. I kept the fire going, moving wood in and out to keep the cabin warm. I kept checking the windows and the door locks. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like someone had been near the cabin in the night. The day passed slowly. I hiked around the nearby woods, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound. The trees looked peaceful in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees again, the silence fell heavily once more. I lit the fire early and sat close, my eyes on the windows. The wind started to pick up, rattling the cabin. Suddenly, a loud banging sound shook the front door. I jumped up, hard in my throat. The noise came again, heavy and sharp, like someone pounding with a fist or a heavy object. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the window, but the darkness outside was thick, the snow falling harder now. I didn't open the door. Instead, I pulled the curtains closed and backed away slowly. The banging continued for several minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I spent the rest of the night awake, fire blazing, flashlight in hand. Every small noise made me jump. The creak of the floor, the whistle of the wind, the tapping of frozen branches. I didn't sleep well at all. The next morning, I woke before dawn and peered outside. The snowstorm had passed, leaving a thick blanket of fresh snow covering the ground. But the snow was disturbed around the cabin footprints. At first, I thought they might be mine, but as I looked closer, they didn't match my boots. The prints were larger, heavier, and irregular. They circled the cabin, going around the back and along the side where the scratch marks had been. The prints stopped near the tree line, but something had definitely been here overnight. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been close, maybe watching me, maybe waiting. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. I packed a bag with essentials, water, some food, my jacket, my flashlight. I decided to leave that day no matter what. The isolation was no longer peaceful but frightening. Before I left, I took one last look around the clearing. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch near the back of the cabin. It was dark, like part of a jacket or shirt, and fresh. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I tucked it into my pocket as evidence, just in case. The drive back down the narrow roads was tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road was empty, silent except for the sound of the tires crunching on snow. When I got to the nearest town, I stopped at the local police station. I handed over the fabric and described what had happened. They took it seriously, promised to check the area. I gave them the address of the cabin and told them about the footprints and the banging on the door. They told me there had been reports of a group of people living rough in the woods nearby, breaking into cabins and stealing supplies. Apparently, they avoided towns but weren't shy about trespassing in the forest. Sometimes they got violent if confronted. It explained the noises, the scratch marks, the banging. I felt shaken but also relieved that I hadn't encountered them directly. The isolation that had once promised peace had turned into a dangerous trap. I didn't return to that cabin. Instead, I took the memory with me, the silence, the cold, the feeling of being watched, as a warning about how even the quietest places can hide real threats. Not ghosts or monsters, just people desperate enough to invade your space and take what they want. And sometimes that's scarier than any story. The air was cold and sharp as I pulled my coat tighter around me, stepping out of the car onto the gravel driveway that led to the cabin. It was late October, the kind of autumn night when the wind cuts through layers of clothing like a blade, carrying the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. The trees stood like dark sentinels all around, their branches bare or nearly so, and the fading light of dusk left everything in a deep gray shadow. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. A chance to get away from the noise and pressure of the city, to spend some quiet time alone in the woods. The cabin itself was old, made of thick, weathered logs that looked like they'd been stacked 100 years ago. It had a steep roof, covered in dark shingles, with a stone chimney curling smoke into the twilight sky. I'd found it on a rental site, described as rustic but cozy, far enough off the main roads to offer real privacy. Exactly what I needed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of city noise, but a stillness that felt complete, almost unnatural. No cars, no distant voices, no hum of electricity. Just the wind moving the dry leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I left my backpack on the porch and pushed open the heavy wooden door. It groaned on its hinges, and inside the cabin was dim but warm from the small wood stove that someone had already lit before I arrived. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved through the small space. There was a simple kitchen with a metal sink, a few cabinets, and an old table covered in dust. The living area had a threadbare couch and a bookshelf filled with dog-eared paperbacks and old magazines. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, but I preferred the soft glow of the stove's fire. The smell of wood smoke mixed with something else. Old pine, damp earth, and a faint hint of mildew. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. I set up my sleeping bag in the small bedroom off to one side and stacked some dry wood next to the stove. Outside, the light was fading fast, and soon the forest swallowed the last of the daylight. I fed the fire, and soon the whole cabin was glowing softly, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. I felt good being there, surrounded by trees and quiet. But as the night deepened, I started to notice small sounds, soft thumps against the walls, the occasional snap of a twig outside, and sometimes a low rustling, like something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, maybe deer, or the wind shaking the branches. I reminded myself this was what I wanted, to be alone with nature. I cooked a simple meal on the old stove, canned soup heated in a battered pot, and ate slowly at the table. Outside, the moon was rising, pale and cold behind a thin layer of clouds. I put on a sweater, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat near the fire with a book, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that crept into the edges of my mind. The cabin had no electricity, no phone signal, no internet. I had come here for peace, but after a while, the isolation started to feel heavy. The silence pressed in around me. The shadows moved strangely in the firelight, and every small noise seemed louder than it should be. At some point, I noticed the front door wasn't quite shut. I was sure I'd closed it tight, but the wooden latch was loose, swinging slightly in the draft. I stood up and pushed it firmly closed, feeling a cold spike of worry that I tried to shake off. Maybe the wind had opened it a little, or maybe I hadn't fastened it properly. I checked the windows next. The glass was old and uneven, with tiny cracks in the corners. Through them, the trees were black shapes against the night sky, branches scratching faintly at the panes. I could see nothing moving, but the shadows beyond seemed deeper somehow, as if the darkness was thicker here than anywhere else I'd ever been. I went back to the fire and sat down, my eyes flicking to the door every few minutes. The thumping sounds outside continued, soft, irregular, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I kept telling myself it was just an animal or the wind, but the noises didn't sound natural. They were too steady, too deliberate. After a while, I started hearing something else. A faint scraping sound at the back of the cabin, like nails dragging across wood. My heart began to race, and I stood, moving cautiously toward the back door. I peered out into the dark, but all I could see were the trees, silhouetted against the night. I thought about calling out, but there was no one to hear me. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the forest was vast and empty. I felt suddenly very small and vulnerable. I locked the back door, checked the windows again, and moved the heavy furniture in front of the front door just to feel safer. My hands trembled a little as I did it, and the firelight seemed too weak against the dark outside. The thumping and scraping noises didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more frequent. They moved around the cabin, circling it like some unseen watcher. I stayed by the fire, clutching a small hunting knife I'd packed, trying to convince myself to stay calm. Sleep was impossible. Every crack and rustle made me jump. I sat huddled near the stove for hours, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the windows, my ears straining for any sign of what might be out there. Near dawn, the noises finally stopped. The forest fell silent again. Exhausted, I lay down on the floor near the stove and tried to rest. When the first light came through the windows, I saw the evidence of the night's events. The back door, though locked from the inside, had deep scratches gouged into the wood. The front door had been pushed hard enough to knock the furniture aside, and muddy footprints surrounded the cabin, circling it completely. I stepped outside, heart pounding, scanning the woods. The footprints were large, uneven, with deep claw marks embedded in the mud around them. Whatever had been here was big and strong, far larger than any deer or bear I'd ever seen. I spent the morning clearing up and making sure every door and window was secured tightly. I built a makeshift barricade of logs against the back door and hung my backpack from a high branch out of reach. I realized then just how unprepared I was. I had planned for a quiet weekend, not for being stalked by some unknown presence. I thought about leaving, but my car was parked at the trailhead, miles down a narrow dirt road that might be blocked by fallen trees or mud. I had no cell signal to call for help. I was trapped. That day, I moved slowly and carefully, never straying far from the cabin. I kept the fire burning, not just for warmth, but to keep the dark at bay. Every sound made me freeze, waiting for something to appear in the shadows. At one point, I saw a figure in the distance, a large, dark shape standing just beyond the trees, watching me. It didn't move, just stood there, silent and still. I didn't dare approach. Instead, I retreated inside and locked every door again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of fear and tension. I avoided looking out the windows after sunset, focusing instead on keeping the fire alive and listening to the sounds of the night. On the third day, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, stuffed as much as I could into my bag, and checked the doors one last time. The footprints were still there, circling the cabin, but the figure hadn't appeared since the morning. I stepped out, heart pounding, and headed for the trail that would lead me back to the car. The forest was quiet, but every step felt heavy with dread. The wind whispered through the trees, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something watching me. Halfway down the trail, I heard the thumping again, this time closer, faster. I broke into a run, my breath ragged, legs burning. The trail curved ahead, and I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach the car. When I burst out onto the dirt road, the car was waiting, its headlights off but the engine still warm. I scrambled in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The roar of the motor felt like a shield against the darkness behind me. As I drove away, the trees thinned and the sky brightened. The cabin disappeared behind a bend in the road, swallowed again by the forest. I never went back. The scratches on the doors, the muddy footprints, and the dark figure in the woods haunted my thoughts for weeks afterward. I told myself it was probably a wild animal or some drifter passing through, but deep down I knew it was something else. Something watching, waiting, and for all the peace I had hoped to find, I came away with a memory of cold fear and endless shadows, a reminder that some places are better left alone.